She arrived with nothing: a cracked wagon, a sick mother, and a letter she'd written so carefully because it was the last door she had left to knock on. They laughed at her, called her weak, said a woman like her had no place on a ranch like this. But beneath the wealth of Silver Creek, a powerful man was running a silent war to steal everything. And the one person standing between him and total victory was the woman everyone had already dismissed. This is the story of Elena Carter. If this is the kind of story that keeps you watching, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon came down the last hill into Silver Creek Valley, just as the afternoon light started going flat and gray. The kind of October sky that didn't commit to anything. Not rain, not sun, just a cold, indifferent stretch of cloud that pressed down on the land like a lid on a pot. Elena Carter sat on the driver's bench with the reins loose in her hands and let the old mare find her own pace down the rutted track, because there was nothing to hurry toward anymore, and she knew it. Beside her, tucked under a wool blanket that had seen better decades, her mother slept in that shallow, effortful way sick people sleep, not resting so much as retreating. Margaret Carter was 53 years old and looked 70. The cough had started the previous winter, back when they still had a house in Billings and a small savings account at the First Territorial Bank, and it had never fully left. It had just settled in, patient and permanent, like an unwanted boarder who'd stopped pretending he intended to leave. Elena kept her eyes on the valley opening below them. She'd heard about Silver Creek Ranch the way you heard about everything in Montana cattle country. From other people's mouths, half true and half legend, inflated and compressed depending on who was telling it. The biggest private operation in the territory, 15,000 acres running from the foothills down to the creek basin, 2,000 head of cattle, maybe more. Wyatt Beaumont's name said alongside the ranch the way a man's name gets said alongside a mountain, not as if he owned it exactly, but as if they had become the same thing over time. What Elena had heard less about, and cared more about, was the job posting that had been pinned to the bulletin board outside the Billings General Store 6 weeks ago. Cook needed. Silver Creek Ranch. Room and board included for right candidate. Inquire by post to W. Beaumont, Silver Creek Valley, Cascade County. She had written the letter the same afternoon. She'd written it carefully, the way you write something when you know it might be the last door you have left to knock on. The valley floor was flat and wide, cut through the middle by the creek itself. Still running clear this late in the season, threading between cottonwoods that had gone yellow and half bare. The ranch buildings came into view gradually. First the massive barn with its dark timber framing, then the bunkhouse and outbuildings arranged behind it, and finally the main house set apart on a slight rise, 2 stories of solid construction with a covered porch running the full width of the front. It was not a beautiful house. It was a house built to last. Elena pulled the wagon to a stop near the main gate and sat for a moment, taking inventory of herself the way you do when you're about to walk into somewhere that matters. Dress, clean, though the hem was frayed. Hair, pinned up, mostly under control. Hands, rough from the weeks of travel and the months before that of doing everything herself. She couldn't fix any of it. She climbed down from the wagon and tied the mare to the post. A man came out of the barn before she reached the gate. He was maybe 40, thick through the chest, with a sun-darkened face and the particular squint of someone who spent most of his life outdoors reading weather. He stopped when he saw her and took her in with the kind of quick, comprehensive assessment that ranchmen developed after years of sizing up horses and strangers. "Help you?" he said. Not unfriendly, just economical. "I'm looking for Mr. Beaumont," Elena said. "My name is Elena Carter. I wrote about the cook position." The man's expression shifted. Not quite a smirk, but the precursor to one. "You wrote that letter?" "I did." He looked at the wagon, looked at the outline of her sleeping mother under the blanket, looked back at Elena. "Hank," he called over his shoulder, without turning around. "Go get Mr. Beaumont." A younger man materialized from somewhere behind the barn and disappeared toward the main house at a jog. The first man, he hadn't offered his name, crossed his arms and continued standing between Elena and the gate in a way that was technically not blocking her, but functionally was. "You come far?" he asked. "From Billings. Long way to come for a cooking job." "It's a long way to go for anything worth having," Elena said. He didn't have a response to that. They stood in silence until the younger man came back, and behind him, walking unhurried from the main house, came Wyatt Beaumont. He was not what she'd expected, though she would have had trouble articulating exactly what she'd expected. He was somewhere north of 40, lean in the way that came from decades of real work rather than deliberate effort, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had the quality of weathered good wood, marked by time but not diminished by it. He walked like a man comfortable on his own land, which was different from the way men walked who were merely comfortable with themselves. He stopped a few feet from the gate and looked at her with gray eyes that were neither warm nor cold, evaluating. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Beaumont, you're younger than I pictured." "Your advertisement didn't specify an age requirement," Elena said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "No, it didn't." He glanced at the wagon. "Your mother? She's unwell. I mentioned that in my letter. She won't be any trouble. She'll stay in whatever quarters you can spare and rest. She doesn't need much." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. The man with the crossed arms was watching this exchange with poorly concealed skepticism. "I've had responses from 11 people about that position," Wyatt said. "Most of them had more experience than you." "I know," Elena said. "I also know I'm the only one who bothered to include a complete sample menu in their letter and specific notes on provisioning for a crew of 20 in a Montana winter. If experience was the only thing that mattered, you'd have already hired someone." Wyatt studied her. The gray eyes were doing something she couldn't quite read. "Jeb," he said to the man with the crossed arms, "open the gate." Jeb Calhoun's name, Elena learned over the following days, was attached to opinions the way a post was attached to barbed wire. Every opinion had barbs, and there were a lot of them. He was Wyatt's foreman, had been for 11 years, and he regarded Elena's presence in the Silver Creek kitchen with the particular displeasure of a man who had decided something was wrong before he had any evidence and was now committed to finding the evidence. "She's going to last 2 weeks," she heard him tell another hand, a lanky young man named Pete Dolan, on her third morning, when they apparently thought she was still in the root cellar taking inventory. "She's soft. You can see it. Grew up in a town. Doesn't know what real work looks like." "She got breakfast on the table for 22 men at 5 in the morning, Pete said. He sounded uncertain, like a man who'd made up his mind but was finding the evidence inconvenient. "Any woman can scramble eggs," Jeb said. Elena came up from the root cellar with a crate of dried beans and walked past both of them without stopping. "Those were not scrambled eggs," she said without looking up. "They were soft-set with the yolks still running, the way men who work in cold weather need their protein in the morning. There's a difference, and it matters." She set the crate on the kitchen table. "Lunch is at noon. If you're going to stand around talking, stand somewhere that's not in my kitchen." Pete Dolan made a sound that was half laugh, half choke. Jeb Calhoun's face went a complicated color. He did not warm to her, but he stopped standing in her kitchen. The Silver Creek cook's quarters were a single room off the back of the main house. Small, but solid, with a real floor and a window that faced east. Elena moved her mother in on the first day, setting up the narrow bed against the wall and arranging their few belongings with the economy of someone who had learned not to take up more space than was offered. Margaret Carter woke up long enough to look around the room and say, "It's a good room, Ellie." "It is," Elena agreed. "How are the people?" Elena considered this honestly. "Some of them are decent. Some of them have decided they don't like me yet." Her mother made a sound that was equal parts cough and dry laugh. "That's most places." "Yes," Elena said. "It is." She sat with her mother until the older woman slept again, and then she went back to the kitchen, because there was work to do, and work, right now, was the only thing Elena had. The Silver Creek kitchen was a large room that had been neglected in the specific way kitchens get neglected when the person responsible for them has stopped caring. The previous cook, a man named Craddock, who'd left suddenly and under circumstances nobody fully explained, had apparently operated on the principle that food needed only to be hot and plentiful, and that anything beyond that was vanity. The storage was disorganized, the iron cookware was seasoned inconsistently. The dry goods were stored in no particular order, so that you had to excavate through sacks of cornmeal to find the salt. Elena spent her first 2 days cooking and reorganizing simultaneously, one process funding the other. She cooked well enough to establish that she could, and while the food was going or resting or proving, She sorted and labeled and arranged until the kitchen made sense. On the evening of the third day, Wyatt Beaumont came to the kitchen door. She was finishing the cleaning after supper, a beef and root vegetable stew with cornbread, and she heard the knock and said, "Come in," without turning around. He came in, looked around the kitchen, and was quiet for a moment. "It's different in here," he said. "I found 17 pounds of dried apples behind the cornmeal." She hung the last pot on its hook. "I've organized the storage so that things can be found without excavating. The inventory list is on the wall by the door, so whoever does the ordering knows what needs to be replenished before it runs out, not after." "Craddock never did that." "I can see that." Wyatt leaned against the doorframe in a way that was tired rather than casual. He'd been out since before she was awake and back only an hour ago, and the day showed on him. "The men said supper was good. The men said it was good by eating 2 portions each without complaint. I don't need it said out loud." He looked at her directly, and for the first time she had the sense that he was not evaluating, but actually seeing. "Why did you really come here, Miss Carter? And I'm not asking for the polite answer." Elena turned and faced him. "We lost our house in August. Bank called the note. My father had borrowed against it before he died, and we didn't know the terms until it was too late. My mother needs somewhere warm and stable to recover, and I need employment that includes room and board. I'm a good cook, and I work hard, and I don't expect anything I haven't earned. That's the complete answer." He nodded, slowly. "Fair enough." He pushed off the doorframe. "The men take breakfast at 5. I'd appreciate it if the coffee was ready by 4:30. "It was ready at 4:15 this morning," Elena said. He almost smiled. Almost. "Good night, Miss Carter." "Good night, Mr. Beaumont." October became November, and November announced itself with the kind of cold that felt personal. A wind that came down off the mountains with nothing kind in it, driving the temperature to places that made the mornings feel like punishment. Elena added layers to what she wore in the kitchen, and started the stoves earlier and began cooking in the way that winter demanded. Heavier, slower, more protein, more fat, because men working cattle in that cold burned through everything they ate and needed more of it. She was learning the rhythms of the ranch the way you learn any complex system, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece connecting to others until a picture formed. Silver Creek ran a large operation with considerable precision. Wyatt Beaumont knew cattle with the intimacy of long study. He knew his land, knew his herd, knew his market. The crew respected him, even the ones who complained about him, which was something different from liking him and worth more. What Elena also noticed, quietly, without comment, the way you notice things when you're new somewhere and smart enough to keep your observations to yourself, was that the respect in the operation and the careful precision all existed alongside something underneath that wasn't quite worry and wasn't quite tension, but was in the vicinity of both. She first noticed it in the way Wyatt read his mail. He came to the kitchen some mornings for coffee before the hands were up, and on 2 of those mornings she watched him set letters on the table and stare at them with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to stay neutral. He didn't talk about the letters, and she didn't ask about them, but she filed the observation away. The second thing she noticed was the conversations that stopped when she came into rooms. Not the conversations men stopped out of courtesy for a woman. She knew what those looked like. These were different, hushed, quick, carrying the specific quality of things being said that the speaker didn't want witnessed. She heard Jeb Calhoun and an older hand named Walt Gruber on the porch one evening, their voices coming through the kitchen window she'd cracked to let out the steam from the canning pot. "Can't cover the 3rd installment if the cattle payment doesn't come in from Helena," Jeb was saying. "I've run the numbers myself." "Beaumont's been saying the payment is delayed," Walt said. "Delayed." Jeb's voice had something in it. 4 weeks delayed. "Payment from the Helena buyers has never been late in 11 years, Walt. Not once." A pause. The wind moved through the eaves. "You think someone's sitting on it?" Walt said. "I think a lot of things," Jeb said. "I think Beaumont doesn't want us to know how tight it actually is." Elena turned back to her canning pot and did not look toward the window. She kept that conversation alongside the others in the quiet part of her mind, where she kept things that mattered. It was in the 2nd week of November that she met Victor Ashford for the first time. He came to Silver Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in a carriage that was expensive in a way designed to be noticed. Dark lacquered wood, brass fittings, a driver in a proper coat. Elena saw it from the kitchen window and watched it pull up to the main house, and watched the man who climbed out of it with the particular wariness she'd developed for men who dressed that carefully when there was no occasion that required it. Victor Ashford was perhaps 50, well-built, with silver hair, and the kind of face that had been handsome long enough ago that the bones still suggested it without delivering on the promise. He had the ease of a man accustomed to being the most important person in a room, not because he was loud or aggressive. He wasn't either of those things, which was somehow worse, but because he'd arranged the world around him until it was true. Wyatt met him on the porch. Elena couldn't hear the conversation from the kitchen, but she could see the body language. Wyatt, upright and deliberate, hands loose at his sides, Ashford affable, gesturing occasionally with one gloved hand, smiling at specific intervals in the way of someone who had rehearsed the smile. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. When Ashford left, Wyatt stood on the porch and watched the carriage go with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that Elena had not seen before. She brought coffee to the porch without being asked. He accepted it without comment. They stood there for a moment in the cold. "That was Victor Ashford," he said eventually. Not to her particularly, more to the air. "I don't know who that is," Elena said. "He owns the Cascade County Merchant Bank and several other things." Wyatt drank the coffee. "He made me an offer for the eastern pasture. The third time in 2 years he's made that offer." "And you don't want to sell it?" "It's the best grazing land I have." "Then why does he keep asking?" Wyatt was quiet. The carriage had disappeared around the valley's curve. "That's a good question, Miss Carter." He handed the cup back. "Thank you for the coffee." He went back inside, and Elena stood on the porch alone for a moment, looking at the road where the carriage had gone, and turned the question over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. The cattle payment from Helena finally came through in the 3rd week of November, partial and late, and with a letter attached that Elena did not read because it was not her business. But she watched what that letter did to Wyatt's face when Walt brought it to the barn where he was working, and she did not like what she saw. That evening, Pete Dolan came to the kitchen to return a mug he'd left there and stayed longer than the return of a mug required. Pete was 22, guileless in the way of young men who haven't yet learned to construct a face for the world, and he had not decided to dislike Elena the way Jeb had, which meant he sometimes talked to her in the artless way of someone who didn't know enough to be careful. "Is it bad?" Elena asked when he had been standing near the work table for 5 minutes without saying anything that explained why he was there. Pete looked up. "What?" "Whatever it is you're trying to decide whether to tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Jeb says there's a real chance we might not make the bank installment in December, if the Helena market stays slow." He said it like he was taking off a bandage, quick to get it over with. "He says Beaumont hasn't told the men, but the books are in trouble." Elena kept chopping the onions she was chopping. "Does Jeb usually know what he's talking about?" "Yeah," Pete said, honestly. "Yeah, he usually does." "All right." She scraped the onions into the pan. "Thank you for telling me, Pete. What are you going to do about it?" "Nothing tonight," she said. "Tonight I'm going to finish supper. The rest I'll figure out." She thought about it for 3 days. The thing about growing up without much money was that it taught you to think about money practically rather than emotionally. Not what it meant, but what it did and didn't do, where it came from and where it went, and what could be substituted when it was missing. Elena had been doing that arithmetic since she was 14, when her father's drinking had made it necessary for someone in the family to be precise. Silver Creek's immediate problem, as she understood it from the fragments she'd gathered, was a shortfall between what was owed and what had come in from the Helena cattle sale. The delayed payment was one piece. The penalties attached to any late bank installment would compound the problem. And Victor Ashford, she kept returning to Victor Ashford, to the 3rd offer in 2 years for the best grazing land on the ranch, to the timing of a payment delay that had never happened before in 11 years. She did not have proof of anything, but she had a picture that was getting clearer. On the 4th day, she went to Wyatt's office. Not the house office, but the small room off the barn where he actually worked, where the real papers were, because she had learned the difference, and knocked on the door. "Come in." She came in. The room was small and crowded with the organized disorder of a working operation. Ledgers, correspondence, maps of grazing land, a board on the wall with strings marking out routes and schedules. Wyatt was at the desk writing and looked up when she entered. Miss Carter. He didn't sound annoyed. He sounded like a man who'd been alone with bad news long enough to be tired of it. Something wrong with the kitchen? The kitchen is fine. She stood across the desk from him because she hadn't been invited to sit. I'd like to talk to you about something else. He set down his pen. Go ahead. I've been listening, she said, deciding that honesty was the only useful approach. I've heard things about the ranch's financial position. I'm not asking you to confirm them. I'm telling you that I have a way to contribute more than cooking, if you're willing to hear it. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. His face was doing the controlled thing again, keeping whatever he was actually feeling from being too visible. You've been listening, he said. I have. I'm sorry if that bothers you. I did it because I wanted to understand where I was and what was actually happening here, not because I was looking for something to use against you. And now you want to… What exactly? I've heard that the winter cattle drive to Butte is being discussed, Elena said. I've heard that the crew is set, but that the camp cook position hasn't been filled since Donnelly's arm. I'd like to go as camp cook. Wyatt stared at her. He had the expression of a man who was recalibrating something. That's a 6-week drive. In Montana winter, it's not appropriate for a woman, Elena said, or not easy. Both, he said flatly. The second one I already know, she said. The first one I don't accept as a reason. She looked at him steadily. I need to earn more than a cook's wages, Mr. Beaumont. My mother's medicine is not cheap, and your current situation may mean I'm out of a position by spring. A drive cook makes twice what I make here, and the money comes in at the end of the drive, in a lump, when it might matter. I can do the work. You know I can do the work. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. You understand what a cattle drive in November looks like, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Cold, Elena said. Exhausting. Full of men who'll resent me for the first 2 weeks and tolerate me for the next 4 if I'm lucky. I'm not asking for it to be easy. I'm asking for the chance. He looked at her across the desk, and whatever the gray eyes were doing now was harder to read than anything before. He picked up his pen, turned it in his fingers once, set it down. The drive leaves in 11 days, he said. Frank Alderman is trail boss. He'll decide if he wants a woman in his camp, not me. If he says no, that's the end of it. All right, Elena said. I'll talk to him tonight. She nodded, started toward the door. Miss Carter? She turned. Why? He said. Just that. One word, but it carried more weight than the others. She thought about how to answer it, and then decided the truth was the only answer worth giving. Because your ranch is the first stable thing my mother and I have had in over a year, she said. And because what's happening to you isn't right. And because… She stopped, started again. Because watching a good man lose something he built because someone else is cheating him is the kind of thing that makes me want to do something about it. Even if the something I can do is just show up and cook better than anyone else on that trail. Wyatt Beaumont looked at her for a long moment. 11 days, he said. Mott. Frank Alderman was a wiry, weathered man of 55 with a white mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent half a century looking into wind. He listened to Wyatt's proposal in the barn the following morning with his arms crossed and his expression giving nothing away. And then he looked at Elena with the measuring look of a man assessing risk on a trail. You ever been on a cattle drive? He said. No, Elena said. I've never been on one, but I've cooked for 22 men in a Montana winter for 3 weeks, and everything on that table was ready on time, hot, and sufficient. I'm stronger than I look, and I don't need comfort to function. I need a wagon and a fire and a list of what needs to go in it. Alderman's mustache moved. You fall behind on the drive, I can't wait. I can't slow the herd for a cook. I don't intend to fall behind. If you get hurt, I can't… I'll take responsibility for myself, Elena said. You give me fair treatment and a reasonable load, and I'll hold my end up. If I can't keep pace, I'll say so and step down. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same chance you'd give any man who showed up here with a record of doing the work. Alderman looked at Wyatt. Wyatt's face was carefully blank. Alderman turned back to Elena, studied her for what felt like a long, grinding minute. Then he said, Provisioning list will be ready tomorrow morning. You'll need to have the wagon packed in 9 days. I'll be ready in 8, Elena said. Well, she wrote 2 letters that night. One to a cousin in Great Falls, explaining that her mother needed monitoring and asking if she could stay. The cousin was decent, if unreliable, and would likely say yes. The second letter was to Margaret herself, who was well enough some days to read. Her mother read it the next morning, sitting up in the bed with the thin winter light coming through the east window. "A cattle drive," Margaret said when she'd finished. "In winter," Elena confirmed. Margaret was quiet. She folded the letter along its original creases. "Your father would have argued with you about this." "I know. He would have told you it was foolish and then helped you pack." "I know that too," Elena said. Her mother held the folded letter for a moment, then set it on the blanket. "Send me news when you can, and take the heavy coat, the one with the wool lining, not the one that looks better." "Yes," Elena said. "Ellie." She turned. "Come back," her mother said. Simply. The way a woman who had already lost one person said it, not as a request, but as a statement of what was required. "I will," Elena said. "I promise." Outside, the November sky had gone flat and white, the kind of white that meant the first real snow was close. Elena stood in the yard for a moment with her breath visible in the cold air, looking north toward the mountains where the drive would take them. She was not without fear. But fear, she had learned, was not the same as doubt. Fear you could carry, doubt would stop you. She went inside to start making her provisioning list. The 9 days passed faster than she would have liked. She spent them the way she spent every challenge, with methodical attention and a refusal to waste energy on things she couldn't change. She organized the drive wagon with the same precision she'd brought to the Silver Creek kitchen, everything in its place, everything she'd need accessible, nothing wasted and nothing forgotten. She inventoried and re-inventoried the dry goods. She rendered and stored the cooking fat she'd need because fat didn't freeze the way water did. She talked to the men who'd been on winter drives before and asked specific questions about what went wrong and what was most needed, and she listened to the answers without pride. Jeb Calhoun watched all of this with an expression that was migrating, slowly and against his evident will, from contempt toward something more complicated. On the evening before the drive left, he came to the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. "What do you need, Jeb?" Elena said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Frank Alderman's crew. Half of them are good men, half of them are going to give you trouble." He said it like he was reading from a list he'd memorized. "Billy Reeves will try to undermine you in front of the others. He did it to the last cook, male, and that cook quit at the halfway point. Don't let him. The moment he starts, shut it down hard. You go quiet on him, it's over." He shifted. "Also, the axle on that wagon has a soft spot on the left side. Don't take it through deep ruts if you can avoid it. I mentioned it to the wheelwright, and he said it'd hold, but I'd watch it." Elena looked at him. Jeb Calhoun met her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked at a point past her left shoulder. "Drive leaves at 5:30, he said. "Get some sleep." He left before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet and thought about how people surprised you sometimes, right when you decided you had them figured out. Then she banked the stove, checked the drive wagon one final time, and went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to her mother's breathing, still uneven, still effortful, but present, and thought about what $11 a week meant over 6 weeks, and what that money might mean when she brought it back to a ranch that needed it, and what it meant to have something worth fighting for after a year of having nothing. The wind moved against the window. In the distance, one of the horses shifted and settled. Elena Carter closed her eyes and let herself sleep, because tomorrow was going to require everything she had. The drive left at 5:20, 10 minutes ahead of the stated time, because Frank Alderman was the kind of man who started early to see who wasn't ready. Elena was ready. She had the wagon hitched and the first morning's provisions staged before 4 o'clock, and when Alderman rode past on his gray gelding doing his pre-departure check, he slowed beside her wagon, looked at it, looked at her, and rode on without comment. That was, she had already learned, as close to approval as Frank Alderman got before 8 in the morning. The herd moved out in the gray pre-dawn cold, 240 head of cattle destined for the Butte market, a crew of 11 men plus Elena, and 6 weeks of Montana winter between Silver Creek Valley and the money that might help save what she'd left behind. Elena kept the wagon at the rear flank, where the drive cook traditionally rode, and watched the valley fall away behind her as the light came up slow and reluctant over the eastern ridge. She did not look back at the ranch. Looking back was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. The first 3 days were merely hard. The terrain was open enough that the cattle moved at a reasonable pace, the weather held at cold but manageable, and the crew largely ignored her in the busy, task-saturated way of men who had enough to occupy them. Elena cooked 3 times daily, pre-dawn coffee and biscuits before they moved, a midday stop of perhaps 40 minutes where she produced something substantial from the wagon, and an evening meal at camp that was the largest and most important of the 3. She worked the timing the way a conductor works an orchestra. Everything had to be ready at the right moment, because hungry men on a cattle drive became difficult men, and difficult men on a cattle drive became dangerous ones. The one who started on the 4th day was Billy Reeves, as Jeb had predicted. Reeves was perhaps 30, good-looking in a way he was aware of, with quick hands and quicker opinions. He'd been civil enough for the first 3 days, ignoring her with more deliberateness than the others, which was its own kind of statement. And then on the 4th evening, when she was serving the stew from the camp pot and the men were coming through with their tin plates, he stopped in front of her and looked at the pot and said loudly enough for the nearest 5 men to hear, "My mother makes better stew than this, and she's been dead 6 years." The camp went a little quieter. Not completely. Just enough to indicate that the men nearest had registered the comment and were watching to see what happened next. Elena ladled stew into his plate without altering her pace. "Then your mother was a fine cook," she said. "Eat it or don't. Either way, move along so the men behind you can get theirs." Reeves didn't move. "I'm just saying, for the wage a drive cook gets paid." "You're saying it to an audience," Elena said, meeting his eyes for the first time. Her voice was level, not loud. "That's different from saying it to me. If you have a real complaint about the food, make it directly, quietly, after the others have eaten. If you're performing for the camp, I'd suggest you do it on your own time because I'm busy." She held his gaze for exactly 2 more seconds, then looked at the man behind him. "Tom, here." Reeves stood there for a moment with his plate and his audience and the realization that neither had done what he'd intended. Then he moved off toward the fire. It wasn't a victory. It was a chess move, and the game had only started. But Jeb had been right. Go quiet, and it was over. Make it louder than he made it, and it became a spectacle. The goal was to defuse without surrendering, and she thought she'd managed that, though she'd know better by morning depending on how Reeves slept on it. He came back for seconds. He didn't say anything when he did, but he came back for seconds, which told her what she needed to know about the stew. The man named Tom Garrett, who'd been standing behind Reeves and received his plate without drama, fell into step beside her wagon the following morning while the crew was breaking camp. He was older, mid-50s, she guessed, with a lined face and the patient manner of someone who'd been on enough drives to have stopped being impressed by most things. "Reeves does that on every drive," Tom said. "Finds whoever's lowest on the chain and pushes until they either push back or fold." "I know the type," Elena said. "You handled it all right." He said it without particular warmth, in the tone of someone delivering a factual assessment. Some of the boys noticed. "I'm not trying to make friends," Elena said. "I'm trying to do a job." Tom Garrett looked at her sideways. "Doesn't have to be one or the other," he said, and walked his horse ahead to where the herd was moving. She thought about that for a while, working the reins in the cold morning, the wagon tracking the frozen ground behind the cattle. The money was the reason she was here, but the reason she was here didn't have to be the only thing she was. By the end of the first week, the crew had sorted itself into the categories that any group under sustained pressure sorted into. The men who ignored her, the men who tested her, and the few who simply got on with work and expected her to do the same. She found she respected the third group most because they weren't being generous, they were being practical. They needed the food hot and on time, and as long as she delivered it, they had no quarrel. That was a cleaner relationship than most she'd had in her life, and she appreciated its simplicity. The snow came on day 8. It arrived overnight, while the camp slept, and Elena woke to 4 inches of accumulated snow and a sky that promised more. She was up at 3:30 anyway. That was her hour, the one before even the early risers stirred. And she looked at the sky and the snow, and then looked at the firewood situation, and made the calculations that the morning required. More wood to get the fire hot enough to matter. The water barrel had developed a skin of ice that needed breaking. The biscuit dough she'd been planning to make required adjustments for cold that changed how flour and fat behaved. She did not revise the menu. She adjusted the method and held the menu because the men needed to eat what they were expecting to eat, not a diminished version of it because conditions had gotten harder. Frank Alderman appeared from his bedroll at 4:15 and stood at the edge of the firelight, looking at the sky with the expression of a man reading a language he'd spent his life learning. "How bad?" Elena asked. "Could be a day's worth," he said. "Could be 3. He crouched near the fire and warmed his hands. "We'll move slower. Keep the herd tighter. I'll need to adjust the noon stop provisions. If you're moving slower, the men will want more at midday. They'll be working harder to keep the cattle from drifting." Alderman looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "All right, what else do I need to know about moving in this kind of weather? In terms of camp positioning, fire breaks, anything that affects where and how I set up?" He studied her for a moment. Then he told her, "The leeward side of the tree line, if there was one, the importance of keeping the wagon downwind of the fire to prevent sparks, the way the cattle would bunch and slow and require more men on the flanks, which meant fewer men at camp for extended periods." She listened and asked 1 or 2 questions and remembered everything he said. When he finished, he said, "You're the first cook I've had on a drive who asked that question." "What question?" "The one about what else you needed to know." He stood. "Most cooks think their job starts and ends at the pot." "My job starts when the drive starts and ends when it ends," Elena said. "The pot is in the middle of it." Alderman nodded and walked back into the pre-dawn darkness, and Elena turned back to the fire and the biscuit dough that needed her attention. The snow fell for 2 days and then stopped, leaving the land white and sharp-edged and brutally beautiful. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Elena's hands, already rough from 3 weeks at Silver Creek and a week on the trail, became something she tried not to look at too closely. Cracked at the knuckles, red and stiff in the mornings until the fire warmed them enough to function. She wrapped them at night and unwrapped them in the morning and got on with it, because there was no other option. She wrote the money down in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. What she'd earned each day, what remained of the drive, what the total would be when it ended. It was a simple arithmetic, and she did it not because she didn't know the numbers, but because seeing them written in her own hand made them real. Made the cold and the exhaustion convert into something tangible. The numbers helped when the mornings were worst. It was on the 12th day that Billy Reeves tried again, and this time it was not about the food. The camp had stopped early due to a river crossing that needed assessment before they attempted it. The current had been pushed up by snowmelt from the higher elevations, and Alderman wanted to scout it before committing the herd. The men were restless in the enforced stillness, cold and edgy, the way men got when they had too much time and not enough to do with it. Elena was reorganizing the wagon, doing the twice-weekly inventory she kept to make sure nothing was running low before it became a crisis. When she heard Reeves behind her, addressing what sounded like 2 or 3 of the other men. "Tell you what's not right," Reeves was saying, in the tone of someone who'd been building toward a speech. "A woman on a cattle drive, it's not how it's done. It's not how it's ever been done, and there's a reason for that. Brings bad luck, everybody knows it. You want to know why we're sitting here waiting on a high river? That's your reason right there." Elena straightened up from the wagon without hurrying. She turned and looked at Reeves and the 2 men with him. One of them, a younger hand named Cody, already looked like he wished he were somewhere else. The other, a broad-shouldered man named Hurley, was watching with the neutral expression of someone who hadn't decided yet. "The river's high because of snowmelt," Elena said, "not because of me. The weather pattern's been tracking north to south since we left. That has nothing to do with who's cooking your meals." "I'm just saying what most men think," Reeves said. "No," Elena said. "You're saying what you think and using most men to make it sound bigger than it is." She looked at Cody, then at Hurley. "Either of you believe a woman in the camp caused the river to rise?" Cody found something interesting to look at on the ground. Hurley, after a moment, said no, a single flat syllable, and walked away toward the herd. Reeves's performance had lost its audience. He knew it, and his jaw tightened. "I don't know why you're on this drive," he said, lowering his voice to something more personal and therefore more unpleasant. "And I don't know what Beaumont was thinking sending a woman to do a man's work, but I know it's not right, and I know it's going to end badly." "My reasons are my own business," Elena said. What I can tell you is that for the last 12 days, the food has been on time, the quantities have been right, and I've pulled my share of the camp work, including the tasks that nobody wanted to volunteer for. If that's ending badly, I'll take it." She turned back to the wagon. "We're done talking, Reeves. Go find something useful to do." She heard him stand there for a moment, then she heard him leave. Tom Garrett materialized beside the wagon shortly after, as if he'd been nearby for the duration of the exchange and had been waiting to see how it ended. He handed her a cup of coffee without comment. She took it. "He won't stop," Tom said. "I know," Elena said. "But he's not going to win either," Tom said. "Just so you know where the men stand, most of them, anyway." She drank the coffee. "Tom." "Thank you." He made a noise that dismissed the thanks as unnecessary and walked back toward the herd, and Elena stood in the thin winter sunlight with her cracked hands wrapped around the warm cup and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, something that was not quite ease but was at least a small, provisional version of it. The river crossing happened the following morning. Alderman had found a ford 2 miles upstream where the current was manageable, and the herd went across in 3 groups through water that came up to Elena's wagon axles and ran fast and black and cold. She kept the team moving and her eyes on the opposite bank, and did not think about what would happen if the wagon stalled mid-crossing. She'd thought through the possibility the night before and prepared what could be prepared, and beyond that there was nothing to do except get across. She got across. The left rear wheel hit a submerged rock, and the whole wagon lurched sideways hard enough to slide the provisions in their crates, and she came close to losing her grip on the reins. She did not lose it. The team found purchase and pulled, and the wagon came up the opposite bank at an angle that wasn't good, but came up. She sat for a moment on the other side, breathing, letting her hands unclench from the reins. Then she climbed down to check the axle. The soft spot Jeb had warned her about was still holding. She pressed her fingers along the wood the way he'd showed her. She'd asked him, the day before she left, to show her exactly what to look for. It had held. But it had been worked by that crossing, and she could feel it. She would watch it, but she could not fix it here, and worrying about it beyond the necessary monitoring was a waste of energy she didn't have. She climbed back up and drove. Back at Silver Creek, meanwhile, things were not holding. She didn't know this. She wouldn't know it for weeks, until she came back and found the shape of what had happened in her absence. But while she was crossing frozen rivers and cooking in snowstorms, and wearing down her hands and her reserves, and her patience in the service of money that might matter, Victor Ashford was sitting in his office in Cascade County and working on a different set of numbers. Wyatt Beaumont found out about the first bank maneuver on a Tuesday in late November, 3 days after the drive had left. He came home from town with the letter in his hand and the expression Elena might have recognized from the porch, if she'd been there to see it. Controlled, deliberate, the face of a man deciding not to let what he felt show until he understood what he was dealing with. The letter was from the Cascade County Merchant Bank, signed by its president, Victor Ashford, and it notified Wyatt that due to a review of loan portfolio risk, his December installment terms had been amended. The payment date moved forward by 2 weeks, and an administrative processing fee of $300 added to the total due. The letter was formal, measured, and perfectly legal, because Ashford had ensured that the fine print in the original loan documents permitted exactly this kind of adjustment under certain conditions, and those conditions had now been declared to exist. Wyatt had read that loan document 100 times. He'd read it again that afternoon, sitting at his barn office desk with the letter beside it, and found the clause. It was there, buried in the language of the third addendum, but there. He sat with it for a long time before he did anything else. What he did next was ride to town and see George Holt, the only lawyer in Cascade County who wasn't connected to Ashford in some way he could identify. George Holt was 63, semi-retired, and practiced law the way old men practice things they'd been doing their whole lives, without urgency and without particular enthusiasm, but with the accumulated precision of long experience. George read the letter and the loan document. He read them both twice. Then he set them on his desk and looked at Wyatt over his reading spectacles. "The clause is real," George said. "I know the clause is real," Wyatt said. "Can he do this?" "He can do this," George said. "It's aggressive and it's designed to cause you difficulty, but it's within the terms you agreed to." "I agreed to those terms without knowing he'd invoke them this way." "That's frequently how these things work." George took off his spectacles. "What's your position if you can't make the adjusted payment date?" 2 weeks shorter than I thought I had, Wyatt said. The Helena payment was already short. If the cattle drive comes back on schedule and at the expected price, I might bridge it. Might. And if it doesn't come back on schedule, then I'm short, Wyatt said it flatly. And if I'm short, what happens? George Holt folded his spectacles carefully. He can accelerate the loan. Call the full balance due. The office was quiet for a moment. He wants the eastern pasture, Wyatt said. That would be my assessment as well. He's been after it for 2 years, and now he's created a mechanism that might force you to sell it to cover the balance, or lose the whole property to foreclosure. George said it without drama, because drama wasn't useful here. He's done this before, Wyatt. Not here, but in other counties. I've seen the pattern. He identifies a property he wants, he gets into the financing, and he engineers a crisis. Wyatt was quiet. Outside the window, the Cascade County Main Street went about its business in the winter cold. Men walking, a horse at a rail, smoke from the general store chimney. Who else knows, Wyatt asked, about what he's done before? Enough people to matter, not enough to stop him. George paused. He has relationships with the county assessor and at least 2 of the town council members. He's been cultivating them for years. That's not coincidence. No, Wyatt said. It's not. He rode back to Silver Creek that evening thinking about the eastern pasture, which was more than grazing land. It was the heart of the operation. The creek ran through it. The best water access, the best shelter in winter, the longest season grass. Without it, the ranch could survive, barely, with significant contraction. But it would never be what it was. It would shrink toward adequacy and probably keep shrinking. He thought about the letter Elena had written him. I'm a good cook, and I work hard, and I don't expect anything I haven't earned. He thought about her standing in his barn office telling him the ranch was the first stable thing she and her mother had had in a year, and that watching a good man lose something he'd built because someone was cheating him made her want to do something about it. She was out there somewhere in the Montana cold doing something about it. He went to his office and started working on what he could do from here. What he could do was not enough, and he knew it, but he did it anyway. Writing to contacts in Helena who might know something about Ashford's previous operations in other counties, reviewing every document in his files for anything that might provide leverage or protection, and identifying which of his neighbors might be allies and which had already been captured by Ashford's network of favors and obligations. The neighbor situation was worse than he'd hoped. Martin Clavel, who ran the second largest operation in the valley, had taken a loan from Ashford's bank 2 years ago and was quiet on the subject of anything related to Ashford. The Duval brothers, who owned the eastern parcels adjoining Silver Creek, had sold Ashford a water access easement that gave him more control over the valley's resources than Wyatt had previously understood. 3 of the town merchants had lines of credit through Ashford's bank. He wasn't the only one in Ashford's orbit. He was just the one Ashford currently wanted something from. Jeb Calhoun found him in the barn one evening toward the end of November, working on the accounts for the 3rd time that week, and sat down on a hay bale without being invited and looked at the ledger from a few feet away. How bad? Jeb said. Wyatt looked up. Jeb had been his foreman for 11 years, and there were things that didn't require framing between them. Bad enough, he said. Better if the drive comes in on time and at price. Worse if it doesn't. Elena's good on the trail, Jeb said. If Alderman gives her a fair shake, she'll hold up. You sound certain of that. Jeb was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man who had made a judgment and was somewhat annoyed about what the judgment had turned out to be. I was wrong about her, he said. She's not soft. She's careful. That's different. Wyatt nodded. I know. She's doing this for the ranch, Jeb said. She understands what's at stake, and she went out there for it. That matters. It matters, Wyatt agreed. Jeb looked at the ledger. The December date. 2 weeks earlier than planned. Can we make it? Wyatt looked at the numbers. With the drive money, and if the Helena correction comes through, we're within reach. Without one or both of those, no. Jeb put his hands on his knees and stood up. He stood there for a moment, not quite leaving, working something through. I have some money put away, he said finally. It came out like something he'd decided against saying and then said anyway. 11 years of foreman wages and nowhere much to spend them. It's not a fortune, but it might close a gap. Wyatt looked at him. I know it's not your way to take that kind of help, Jeb said. I'm not offering it as charity, and I don't want it back as pity either. I want this ranch to survive because it's the best operation in this territory, and it deserves to survive. That's all. He moved toward the barn door. Think about it. He left, and Wyatt sat with the ledger and the lamp and the cold and the knowledge that what was happening to him was not a financial problem. It was a targeted campaign by a man with more resources and fewer scruples, and the only way through it was to find every small advantage available and hold them all simultaneously. He wrote 3 more letters that night. On the trail, Elena didn't know any of this yet. She was 40 miles north of Silver Creek in a frozen camp, awake before dawn as always, coaxing the fire back to life with her raw hands and thinking about the numbers in her notebook and how many days remained between here and the Butte market. She'd heard nothing from the ranch. There was no way to hear anything, out here, except what the wind said, and the wind said nothing useful. She worked the fire until it caught, and then she worked the biscuit dough, and then she started the coffee and watched the sky go from black to gray to the pale thin blue of a Montana winter morning, and thought about nothing except what needed to happen in the next 2 hours. That was how you got through hard things, not by thinking about the end of them, but by being completely present in the immediate task. The fire, the dough, the coffee. The men who would wake cold and hungry and need to be fed before they faced another day of this. Tom Garrett came out of his bedroll at 4:40, which was early even for Tom, and came to the fire and crouched beside it and held his hands toward the heat. Sleep? He said. Some, Elena said. How many days left? 23 if the pace holds. Tom nodded. He looked at the sky with the same reading expression that Alderman had, a decade's worth of drives written into how he looked at clouds and wind direction and the quality of the cold. Weather's going to turn again, he said. When? 2 days, maybe 3. Elena adjusted the biscuit timing in her mind. I'll provision heavier for day after tomorrow. Tom looked at her. In the firelight, his face had the texture of someone who'd been places and come back from them. You know what you're doing out here, he said, in case nobody's said it. You said something like it, Elena said. I meant it more this time. She handed him coffee. He took it, and they sat in the quiet of the pre-dawn camp with the fire between them and the vast cold dark of the Montana territory all around. And Elena felt, not comfort exactly, but the closest thing to it that the trail offered, which was the knowledge that you were not entirely alone in it. Tom, she said. Do you know Victor Ashford? He was quiet for a moment. Know of him, he said. Why? He's been trying to get Beaumont's eastern pasture. Tom turned his cup in his hands. Ashford's been working this territory for 5 years, he said, slow and patient, like a man who knows he's going to win and doesn't mind how long it takes. He paused. What made you think of him now? I've been thinking about him since before I left, Elena said. I can't stop thinking about why a man like that would want one specific piece of pasture badly enough to keep coming back for it 3 times in 2 years. Water, Tom said simply. Elena looked at him. If you control the eastern pasture, you control the Upper Creek access for the whole South Valley, Tom said, not just Silver Creek Ranch. The 3 properties below it, too. You charge access or redirect it or simply hold it as leverage. The pasture's not about cattle, Miss Carter. It's about water rights in a territory that's getting drier every decade. Elena sat with that. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the darkness, a steer moved and settled. He doesn't want the ranch, she said. He wants what the ranch sits on top of, Tom said. There's a difference, and the way to get it is to get the man to sell the one piece, or to foreclose the whole thing and take what he wants out of it afterward. The coffee was cooling in her cup. She drank it anyway. She sat in the firelight and thought about water rights and loan documents and a man in a lacquered carriage with a prepared smile, and thought about Wyatt reading mail with a face he was working hard to keep neutral, and thought about what 23 more days meant and what she would do when she got back. She added wood to the fire. She went back to the biscuit dough. She did not think about the problem anymore that morning, because thinking about it when she had no way to act on it was wasteful, and she could not afford waste out here. But she filed what Tom had told her in the same careful place in her mind where she kept everything that mattered, water rights. That was the thing underneath the thing. That changed what this was. By the time the camp woke around her and the day started in earnest, cold and demanding, and full of the particular difficulties that the trail manufactured fresh each morning. Elena Carter had already been awake for 2 hours and had already learned something that, when the time came, might matter more than anything else. She just didn't know yet what she was going to do with it. The weather turned on the second day after Tom predicted it would, which meant Tom Garrett was a more reliable barometer than the sky itself. Elena had provisioned heavier as she'd promised herself she would, and when the storm came in from the northwest on the afternoon of the 23rd day out, a real storm this time, not the tentative snowfall of the first week, but a full Montana blizzard with wind behind it that made the temperature feel like something from a different planet. She had the camp set up on the leeward side of a long ridge of pine that blocked the worst of it, the fire built in a trench the way Alderman had described, and enough hot food ready that the men came in from the cattle lines cold enough to be dangerous and left the fire warm enough to function. Frank Alderman stood at the edge of the firelight that evening, eating his stew from a tin plate with the methodical focus of a man fueling a machine, and looked at the camp layout and then at Elena and then back at his stew without saying anything. But he ate 2 portions, and for Alderman, Elena had come to understand that was a form of praise that meant more than words. The blizzard ran for 36 hours. They held position. Moving the herd in this was impractical and potentially ruinous. And Elena cooked through it, keeping the fire alive through the night in shifts that required constant attention, banking it against the wind and feeding it carefully, and watching the temperature of the coals the way a doctor watches a patient's breathing. She slept in 2-hour intervals when the fire was stable enough, wrapped in every layer she had, waking with the particular cold alertness of someone whose body had learned to stay close to the surface of sleep out of necessity. On the second night of the storm, the wagon axle finally gave. It didn't fail catastrophically. It wasn't that clean. It cracked along the fault line that Jeb had warned her about, the crack propagating through the wood with a sound she almost missed under the wind, and it was the sudden list of the wagon to the left that woke her from her second sleep interval. She was out of her bedroll and at the wagon in 40 seconds, and she stood in the blowing snow and looked at the damage with the lamp held close and felt the specific coldness of a problem that had no good solution available. The crack was bad enough that loading the wagon fully in the morning would risk a complete break on the trail. She could shift weight, move provisions to the pack horses, reduce the wagon load to the absolute minimum, but that created its own problems because the pack horses were already carrying their share and the cattle drive schedule was not designed with extra margin. She went to wake Alderman. He was not a man who came out of sleep disoriented. He was upright and clear-eyed in 30 seconds, which told her something about the kind of sleep men learned on the trail. He looked at the axle with the lamp, while the wind drove snow around them, and said nothing for a long moment. "How far to the next supply point?" Elena asked. "Ferris Creek Station, 40 miles at regular pace. At reduced load with the wagon? 2 days, maybe less if the storm clears by morning." He ran his fingers along the crack the way she'd run hers earlier. "It'll hold if we don't overload it. I can redistribute. Put the heavy crates on the pack horses and keep only the immediate provisions on the wagon. It'll slow the pack horses some." "It'll slow everything some," Alderman said. It wasn't a complaint, just a fact he was adding to his calculation. "How much do you need to leave behind?" Elena had already been running the numbers in her head since she'd seen the crack. 2 crates of dry goods, the ones we won't need before Ferris Creek. If I plan the next 4 days' meals around what's left on the wagon, we can make it without shortfall." Alderman looked at her in the lamplight, and the look was direct and unadorned and more honest than anything he'd said to her in 3 weeks. "Can you do that? Plan 4 days of meals out of a reduced supply without shorting the men?" "Yes," Elena said. "You're sure?" "I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't." He was quiet for another moment. The wind was doing its work around them, indifferent to their conversation and their problem. "All right," he said. "We'll start the redistribution at first light. Get back to sleep while you can." "I need to reset the fire first." "I know," he said. "I'll do it. Get some sleep, Miss Carter." She looked at him. "You've been up longer than me," he said, with the practicality of someone who allocated resources where they were most needed. "Fire doesn't need both of us. Sleep." She went back to her bedroll and lay in the howling cold and did not sleep immediately because her mind was doing the meal calculations. What was in each crate? What the caloric requirements were per man per day in this temperature? What she could build from what remained? and it was only when the plan was complete and held together that she let herself go under. The storm cleared by mid-morning, leaving the world white and clean and viciously cold. The sky gone to a blue so deep and clear it looked like it had been cut from something. The crew broke camp with the particular efficiency of men who had been still too long and were glad of movement, and Elena worked the redistribution with Tom Garrett and a quiet, reliable hand named Oakes, who didn't talk much but did exactly what was needed without being asked twice. Reeves watched from a distance but did not offer to help, and Elena did not ask him because she had learned by now that asking Reeves for something he hadn't volunteered was a transaction with hidden costs. They moved out with the wagon riding lighter and the pack horses carrying the difference, and the herd moved through the post-storm landscape with the cattle's characteristic reluctance to walk in fresh, deep snow. They balked, they bunched. They required more men on the flanks than usual. But they moved. Everything moved. That was what mattered. The 4-day reduced supply meal plan worked because Elena had built it correctly, which required doing something she did not enjoy doing. She ate less herself. Not nothing. She was not foolish enough to deplete herself entirely because she couldn't do her job running on empty, but she shaved her own portions carefully and fed the difference to the men, and she did it in ways that weren't visible because visible self-sacrifice invited either guilt or condescension, neither of which was useful to her. Tom noticed on the 3rd day. He came to refill his plate at the lunch stop and glanced at what she'd taken for herself, and then he looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a man who registered things. "You're running short," he said. "The men need the calories more than I do today," Elena said. "We'll be at Ferris Creek Station tomorrow." "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "Here." He put half of his second portion back in the serving pot. "Tom, I've done this trail 6 times," he said. "I know how to manage." He picked up his plate, which was now a single portion rather than the double he'd intended, and walked to where the other men were eating. He didn't make anything of it. He just did it and moved on, and Elena stood at the pot and was grateful in the wordless way you were grateful for things that didn't require anything back from you. Oakes did the same thing an hour later and didn't meet her eyes when he did it, which meant he'd heard and decided independently, and the not meeting eyes was a form of dignity he was extending to her, making it not a transaction, just a quiet adjustment between people working the same problem. She reached Ferris Creek Station the following afternoon with the meal supply down to its last margin and the wagon axle holding, cracked but holding, and her hands in a condition she was actively choosing not to examine too closely. The station was a way stop on the Butte Trail, a low building with a barn attached, and a man named Cord Ferris who ran it and had been running it for 20 years and regarded each new party of travelers with the same comprehensive wariness he'd developed after 2 decades of seeing everything. He took one look at Elena and said, "You the cook?" in a tone that suggested he'd heard of stranger things but was working to remember what they were. "I am," Elena said. "Woman cook on a winter drive." He chewed on this. "Alderman must be getting desperate." "Alderman's getting results," Frank said from behind her in the tone of someone closing a subject. "We need an axle carpenter and resupply provisions. In that order." The axle was repaired by a taciturn man who worked wood the way surgeons worked bone, precisely, without sentiment, and with the particular confidence of someone who had done one specific thing for so long that uncertainty no longer visited him. He looked at the crack, looked at Elena, and said, "You drove this how far?" 40 miles after it cracked, Elena said. He made a sound. It held. It held. "Better wood than I thought," he said. He didn't say better driver than I thought, but it was somewhere in the vicinity of what he meant. The repair took 4 hours. Elena spent those 4 hours in the station kitchen, a real kitchen, with a real stove, walls, a roof that blocked the wind, restocking and reorganizing and eating a full meal in the sitting-down manner she had not managed in 3 weeks. She sat at the station table with a plate of beans and salt pork and cornbread and ate it slowly and felt the warmth of the room against her face and thought very deliberately about nothing at all for 20 minutes. Then she stood up, washed the plate, and went back to work. It was at Ferris Creek Station that she found out what was happening at Silver Creek Ranch. There was a letter waiting for her. She hadn't expected a letter, hadn't thought to check, but Cord Ferris mentioned it with the incidental manner of a man who stored information as routinely as he stored provisions. Letter came in for the Silver Creek Drive party, care of Ferris Creek Station. Alderman's name on the outside, but a woman's name inside, they said. The woman's name inside was hers. The letter was from Wyatt Beaumont. She read it standing in the station doorway with the cold at her back and the lamplight in front of her. And she read it twice because the first time through, parts of it didn't fully register. He'd written it in the careful, economical way he spoke. No wasted words, nothing ornamental, just the facts in the order they needed to be understood. The bank installment date had been moved forward. An administrative fee had been added. The adjusted payment was due in 3 weeks from the date he'd written, which meant, accounting for how long the letter had taken to reach her, approximately 18 days from now. The Helena cattle payment correction had come in, but it was smaller than projected. The ranch was short. How short depended on what the Butte market paid for the herd, which he didn't know yet because she hadn't reached Butte yet, and the drive money when she brought it back. He did not ask her to hurry. He did not say he was worried, but he had written the letter, which he would not have done if things were manageable on their own. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest, written at a different sitting, she thought, maybe later in the night, he had added, "Your mother is well. The cousin from Great Falls is a reasonable woman, and your mother appears to like her. I checked on them last week. I thought you'd want to know?" Elena folded the letter along its original creases. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold at her back and thought about 18 days and 600 miles and a payment that the drive money might or might not cover depending on a cattle market she had no control over. She thought about water rights and a man with a prepared smile and loan documents with buried clauses. She thought about Wyatt Beaumont checking on her sick mother last week, which was not something she'd asked him to do and not something she'd expected. She put the letter in her coat pocket beside the notebook with the numbers. Then she went to find Alderman. He was in the barn with the repaired wagon, running his hand along the new axle wood the way you checked work before trusting it. He looked up when she came in. "I need to talk to you about the timeline," she said. "I got word too," he said, "from Beaumont." "Then you know." "I know the drive needs to reach Butte and get paid out in time for the money to be back at Silver Creek before—" He stopped, calculated. "It's tight. Can we push the pace?" "Some." Alderman turned from the wagon. In the barn light, his face had the worn quality of someone running complex logistics in his head simultaneously. "We're 12 days out from Butte at current pace. If we push, cut the rest stop shorter, I can get it to 10. Maybe 9.5. 9.5 days to Butte. How many days to get the money back to Silver Creek? Cattle payment clears in 2 days after sale. Ride back is 4 days hard." He looked at her. "It's going to be very close, but possible." He was quiet for a moment. "Possible," he said. "Not comfortable. The cattle will be pushed. The men will be pushed. There's more risk of loss in the herd if we move faster through this terrain. If we lose cattle, the payment is smaller," Elena said. "And if the payment is smaller—" "I know the math," Alderman said. It came out flat, not unkind. Just the voice of a man who was holding the tension of competing risks and didn't need it articulated further. He turned back to the wagon. "We leave at 4 tomorrow. Not 4:30. 4. "I'll be ready," Elena said. She was. The 9 days from Ferris Creek to Butte were the hardest of the drive. And not because of any single thing, but because of the accumulation. The way difficulty compounded on itself when you were already depleted and the margin for error kept shrinking. The pushed pace meant shorter camp setups, which meant Elena had less time to get the food ready, which meant she slept even less and moved even faster and made the calculations even quicker. She dropped a full hour from her sleep schedule and added it to her preparation time. And she did not complain about this because complaining would have been accurate but useless. Her hands were a problem she managed daily. The cold and the constant wet work, water, fire, dough, dishwater, had taken the skin to a condition that was beyond rough and into something that bled at the knuckles when she made a fist too quickly in the morning cold. She wrapped them before she slept and unwrapped them to work and rewrapped them when the bleeding opened up. And she did this without drawing attention to it because it was her problem to manage and not anyone else's. Tom saw it on the 5th day out of Ferris Creek. He saw it the way he saw most things, without announcement, simply registering and responding. He produced a small tin from somewhere in his kit. "Tallow and pine tar," he said, handing it to her. "My wife makes it. Works on rope burns, works on this." Elena looked at the tin. Thank you. It smells bad, he said. Fair warning. I've been smelling cattle and campfire for a month, Elena said. I think I can manage. Something moved at the corner of Tom's mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the structural precursor to one. And from Tom Garrett, that was as close as she was going to get. The tallow and pine tar mixture did smell bad, and it worked. Her hands were still damaged, but the bleeding reduced, and reduced damage was better than nothing, and nothing was not an option, so she used it every night and kept moving. Billy Reeves had gone quiet over the last weeks, in the particular way of someone who'd tried a thing several times and found it unsuccessful and hadn't yet decided what to do instead. He did his work. He was, Elena had to acknowledge, a capable hand with cattle, even if he was a difficult human being in most other respects. And he ate what she cooked and didn't comment on it and stayed out of her way. It wasn't warmth. It was the pragmatic truce of the trail, where you didn't have enough energy for enemies anymore. On the 7th day out of Ferris Creek, something happened that nobody planned for. The trail crossed a frozen creek, not the dangerous crossing of week 2, just a seasonal creek that had gone solid in the cold. Solid enough that cattle and horses had been crossing it all winter without trouble. The first half of the herd went across without incident. Elena's wagon went across. The pack horses went across. Then the ice decided it was done, and the section beneath the last dozen cattle and 2 of the rear hands gave way. It went fast and loud, a crack that ran through the ice like a thought running through a mind, and then the whole section dropped, and suddenly there were cattle in freezing water and 2 men on horses trying to control animals that were panicking in the worst possible conditions. Elena had already crossed. She heard the crack and turned and saw it in the fraction of a second before everyone else was moving, and she didn't think, she acted. She had the wagon brake set and was off the seat and back at the creek bank in the time it took the nearest hands to register what had happened. The 2 men in the water were Cody and a hand named Marsh. The horses were scrambling for purchase at the broken edge, and the cattle were making the noise that cattle in trouble made, a sustained, low panic that was worse than anything loud. And the creek was deep enough that Cody's horse was fully swimming, which meant Cody was in water to his thighs in a Montana winter. "Rope!" Elena shouted, at nobody in particular and everybody in general, and Tom Garrett had one in his hands already, coming up beside her. What happened next took perhaps 12 minutes, and felt like an hour, and was not clean or heroic or the way it would have been described afterward by someone who wasn't there. The cattle that could be reached were driven toward the bank, and most of them got out, losing 2 head to the current in the chaos that Elena counted later, with the particular grief of someone who understood what those 2 animals represented in dollars. Cody was pulled out with the rope after his horse found its footing and clambered up the bank on its own, and he sat on the snow at the creek's edge, blue-lipped and shaking so hard Elena could hear his teeth from 3 feet away. She had him wrapped in every dry blanket she could pull from the wagon in under a minute. She had the fire going, real fire, not a trail fire, the biggest she'd built since leaving Silver Creek, in 4 minutes, which required everything she had, and 2 of the hands helping without being asked. She had hot coffee in Cody's hands in 7 minutes. She kept him at the fire for 45 minutes, while Alderman made the call about whether to continue that day or camp. Alderman camped. While the camp settled and the remaining cattle were accounted for, and Cody's color slowly came back from blue to the normal weathered red of a man who worked outdoors, Elena took inventory of the loss and the adjusted numbers. 2 cattle. The delayed camp time would add half a day to the push. The remaining timeline to Butte was now 11 days from when they'd started, which meant they were behind where they'd been at Ferris Creek. She sat with the notebook at the fire that evening while the camp was quiet, and the men were in their bedrolls and Cody was sleeping, really sleeping. Deeply, the sleep of someone whose body had decided it was done for the day. And she added and subtracted and looked at what remained. Still possible, barely. She wrote the new number at the bottom of the page and looked at it for a long time. Cody came to her wagon the next morning before the camp fully woke. He was still pale, moving carefully, but upright. He stood by the fire she'd already rebuilt and looked at her with the direct, undecorated expression of a young man who hadn't yet learned to make things complicated. "I want to say thank you," he said, "for yesterday, the blankets and the fire, and—" He stopped. "I think you might have—" He stopped again, started over. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Elena said. She handed him coffee. He took it and stood there for a moment. I wasn't very decent to you when you first came on the drive, he said. It came out like he'd been carrying it for a while. I went along with some things Reeves said that I shouldn't have. Elena looked at him. He was 20, maybe 21, and he had the face of someone trying to do the right thing, which was harder at 20 than people who weren't 20 usually remembered. You've been decent enough since then, she said. That's what counts. Still, he said. Still, she agreed. But I'm not holding it against you. Drink the coffee. You need the heat. He drank the coffee. He went and did his work. Elena went and did hers, and the drive moved north toward Butte with 9 days remaining and everything still uncertain. It was on the second to last day before Butte that Reeves did the thing she hadn't anticipated. The camp was settling for the night, the men eating in the tired, economical way of people who were nearly through something hard, and Elena was cleaning the cookpot when Reeves came and stood near the fire with his plate and said quietly, not performing this time, just talking, "How much does Beaumont need?" She looked up. He met her eyes. The quick, handsome face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before, which was nothing, just looking, without the performance or the edge. I heard what Tom and Garrett were saying about the situation back at the ranch, the bank thing. That's not your concern, Elena said. Maybe not. He was quiet for a moment. I've got wages saved, 3 months' worth. He said it the way Jeb Calhoun had said it, like something he'd decided against and then decided for. I don't know what that covers. Elena straightened. She looked at him across the fire and tried to understand what was happening, because it didn't fit the picture she'd built of Billy Reeves over 5 weeks on the trail. Why? She said. He looked away, back. I had a place once, he said. Small. Nothing like Beaumont's operation. Bank came for it because my father got sick and couldn't make a payment. They didn't give him any room. The handsome face closed for a moment around something private. I know what that looks like when it's happening on purpose and when it's just bad luck. Sounds like Ashford's doing it on purpose. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the dark, cattle moved. Elena said, it would be Beaumont's decision to accept it or not. I can't make that call for him. I know, Reeves said. I'm not asking you to. He picked up his plate. I just wanted you to know it was available. In case. He went back to where the men were eating, and he did not look at her again that evening, and Elena stood at the cookpot for a moment longer than she needed to before she resumed cleaning it. She had been wrong about him, not entirely wrong. He was difficult, and he had made her work harder than it needed to be in the first weeks. But underneath the difficulty was a history she hadn't known about, and underneath the history was something that looked, in the cold firelight on a Montana trail 3 days from the end of the hardest thing she'd done, recognizably human. She filed it away. Butte came into view on the morning of the final day. A proper town. Smoke from the smelters visible from miles out, the sound of it reaching them before the sight did in the way busy places announced themselves. Elena stood on the wagon seat with the reins in her scarred hands and looked at it coming and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, which was the loosening of a tension she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped being aware of it as separate from herself. The herd came into the Butte stockyards in the early afternoon. Alderman handled the sale. Elena stood at a distance and watched the cattle buyer walk the herd and make his assessment, watched Alderman negotiate with the particular calm of a man who knew what he had and wasn't going to be rushed, watched the numbers go back and forth in the way of any transaction where both parties knew the real price was somewhere between the first offer and the first counter. The final number, when it was done, was not what Alderman had hoped for. The winter market was softer than projected, which meant the per-head price was lower, which meant the total was lower. Not disastrously lower, but lower. Alderman found her afterward and told her the number, and Elena did the arithmetic in her head in the time it took him to say it. It's less than we needed, she said. It's less than we needed, he confirmed. It covers the crew wages and the drive costs. Your cut is what was agreed. But as to what Beaumont needs for the bank, it's short, Elena said. By how much? She looked at the number again in her head, thought about what Jeb had offered, thought about what Reeves had said by the fire last night. I don't know yet, she said. I need to get back and see where things stand. She was paid her wages on the spot, cash, correct to the penny. She counted it twice and put it inside her coat, close to the letter from Wyatt that was still in her pocket. She left Butte the following morning before the rest of the crew was fully awake. On a horse Alderman arranged for her, riding south toward Silver Creek with the drive money against her chest and the winter landscape opening around her and her mind already running the numbers of what was waiting for her when she got there. She rode 4 days through cold that seemed personal, stopping only for the horses' sake and her own minimum requirements, sleeping in roadhouses, and one night in a barn when the roadhouse was full, eating what was fast and available. Her hands had stopped hurting in the specific way they'd hurt on the drive. They'd settled into a lower register of damage that she'd apparently stopped processing as sensation, and she rode with them wrapped and functioned. On the 4th day, Silver Creek Valley came into view below the ridge she'd crossed in October, with a wagon full of her mother's belongings, and a letter she'd written carefully because she was almost out of doors to knock on. She stopped the horse at the ridge and looked down at the ranch, the barn, the bunkhouse, the main house on its rise, the creek threading through the eastern pasture, the pasture that was the real target of everything that had happened, the water rights that sat underneath the land like the actual prize in a game where the prize had never been announced out loud. She'd been gone 42 days. She'd left with a plan to earn enough to matter, and she'd earned what she'd earned, and it was not quite enough. And that was the truth she was riding back with. But she was riding back with other things too. Things she'd gathered over 6 weeks on the trail that were not money and not immediately convertible to money, but might, if she was right about what she'd been thinking since Tom Garrett said the word water in the firelight at Ferris Creek Station, matter more than the money in the end. She put her heels to the horse's flanks and rode down into the valley, toward what was coming, into the reckoning that had been building since October and was now, whether she was ready or not, arriving. Wyatt was in the barn when she rode in, which was where he usually was at 4 in the afternoon, and he came out when he heard the horse and stood in the barn doorway and looked at her for a moment before either of them said anything. She had been gone 42 days. She looked it. The cold had done things to her face, not damaged it exactly, but clarified it, the way prolonged difficulty clarified things, stripping away anything that wasn't essential. Her hands, when she dismounted, moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain that had become so habitual it no longer registered as pain. "You're back," Wyatt said. "I'm back," Elena said. He took the horse's reins from her without asking and led the animal toward the barn, and she walked beside him, and neither of them said anything for the length of the barn aisle while he unsaddled and watered the horse, and she stood and let the stillness of an enclosed space without wind settle over her like something she'd forgotten existed. "How bad is it?" she said when he came back from the water trough. Wyatt leaned against the stall door. The gray eyes were doing the controlled thing, but he was tired under it, the kind of tired that 42 days of fighting something without resolution produced. "The adjusted payment is due in 4 days," he said. "I've put together everything available. Your drive wages, Jeb's contribution. He told you he offered. He told me. George Holt helped identify some additional funds. Martin Clavel came through with a short-term loan, which surprised me." A pause. "We're still short, not enormously, but enough that if we can't close it in 4 days, Ashford has the right to accelerate the full balance." "How much short?" He told her the number. Elena had been running estimates in her head for 4 days of riding, and the number was close to what she'd feared, close enough that the remaining gap felt both bridgeable and impossible simultaneously, the way gaps at the edge of financial crisis always felt. "Reeves offered his wages," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "Billy Reeves." "I know," she said. "It surprised me too." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Even with Reeves's contribution, we're short." "I know." Elena reached into her coat and produced the notebook, the small one she'd carried on the trail, with the daily money tallies and the meal calculations, and on the last few pages, the notes she'd been building since Tom Garrett said the word water in the firelight at a way station 50 miles north of here. She set it on the stall rail between them. "I need you to look at these," she said, "and I need you to tell me if I'm wrong, because if I'm right, the money is the smaller problem." Wyatt picked up the notebook. She watched him read. She watched his face as he moved through the pages. The daily tallies at first, which he moved through quickly, and then the later pages, where she'd laid out what she knew about the water rights and the eastern pasture and the pattern she'd constructed from what Tom had told her and what she'd already known and what she'd spent 4 days on horseback thinking about until it cohered into something that felt true. He read those pages twice. Then he set the notebook down and looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise. He was not a man easily surprised, but was something more complicated than anything she'd seen on his face before. Water rights, he said. The eastern pasture controls Upper Creek access for the entire South Valley, Elena said. Not just your operation, 3 other properties downstream. If Ashford gets that land, either through a forced sale of the parcel or through foreclosure of the whole ranch, he doesn't just get grazing land. He gets the ability to charge water access fees to every rancher below you on that creek, or to use the threat of that to control how they vote, how they borrow, who they sell to. He's been building toward this for 5 years, Wyatt said. It wasn't a question. He was assembling it as he said it, fitting pieces into a shape that had been there all along but that he hadn't seen complete until now. Tom Garrett has been on drives through 4 counties, Elena said. He's seen Ashford's pattern before. Different properties, same method. Get into the financing, manufacture a crisis, acquire at distressed prices. She picked up the notebook. But there's something different here. The water rights make this bigger than just your ranch. If the downstream property owners understood what was actually at stake, if Martin Clavel and the Duval brothers and the others knew they weren't watching someone else's problem, but their own problem happening 1 step removed. They might not stand aside, Wyatt said. They've been standing aside because they think it doesn't concern them, Elena said. Because Ashford has kept it looking like a private transaction between a bank and a borrower. If they understood the water rights piece, that's not a simple conversation to have in 4 days, Wyatt said. He wasn't dismissing it. He was doing what he did, assessing logistics, real constraints, what was actually possible. Clavel I can reach tomorrow. The Duvals have been quiet since they gave Ashford that easement. I don't know where they stand now. The town merchants are complicated. Not the merchants, Elena said. Not first. The ranchers who use the creek. Wyatt looked at her directly. You want to go to them. I want to go to all of them, she said, and I want to do it publicly. Not ranch to ranch in private conversations that Ashford can respond to individually before they build into anything. I mean publicly, in town, where everyone can hear it at once. The barn was quiet around them. One of the horses shifted. The cold came through the boards in the measured way it did in properly built structures, present but contained. Ashford will be there, Wyatt said. He's in town most Thursdays, and Friday is the general store market day. If you do this publicly on Friday, good, Elena said. I want him there. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her with the gray eyes, and whatever was happening behind them was not simple, but when he spoke his voice was level and direct. You just came off 6 weeks on a winter cattle drive. You rode 4 days straight to get back here. Your hands are... He stopped. You don't have to be the one to do this. Who else is going to do it? Elena said. Not bitterly, just accurately. He didn't have an answer to that because they both knew there wasn't one. The people who might have done it earlier had been managed out of position by 5 years of careful relationship building and strategic obligation. The merchants had credit lines. The neighboring ranchers had their own complications. Wyatt himself was the subject of the dispute, which meant anything he said publicly would be dismissed as self-interest. Elena was none of those things. She was a woman who had arrived with nothing and earned every dollar she had and had no stake in the outcome except the one she'd chosen to have. Friday, Wyatt said. Friday, Elena confirmed. She slept that night for 11 hours in the cook's quarters off the back of the main house, in the narrow bed she'd set up for herself in October, and she slept without dreaming because she was too tired for dreams. She woke to her mother's voice in the adjacent room. Her cousin had brought Margaret back from Great Falls 2 days ago, apparently, and Margaret Carter's voice was the first thing Elena heard in the morning, talking to the cousin in the unhurried manner of someone who had learned not to waste breath on urgency. Elena lay still for a moment and listened to her mother's voice and let it be simply that, her mother's voice, present and audible, not the labored breathing of someone retreating, but the actual voice of a person who had something to say and was saying it. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and started the stoves. Her mother found her there an hour later and stood in the kitchen doorway with the wool blanket from the bed wrapped around her shoulders. She always ran cold. and looked at Elena with the comprehensive attention of a mother who had learned to read her daughter in the space between sentences. "You look terrible," Margaret said. "Thank you," Elena said. "I mean it. You look like you've been wrung out and hung up." "I've been on a cattle drive for 6 weeks, Mama." Margaret came into the kitchen and sat in the chair by the stove, which was the warm chair, and wrapped the blanket tighter. "He told me," she said. "Beaumont. He came by twice. He's a serious man." "I know." "Quiet," Margaret said. "Thinks before he talks. Your father was the opposite of that." "I know that too." Her mother watched her work for a moment in the manner of someone who had additional things to say and was deciding how to arrange them. "This thing on Friday," she said. Elena looked up. "He told you that too?" "He told me last night after you went to sleep. He looked like a man who had been carrying something by himself for too long and wasn't sure if putting it down was allowed." Margaret adjusted the blanket. "Are you sure about what you're doing?" "No," Elena said, "but I'm doing it anyway." Her mother nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected and was also the correct one. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing. Rest. Stay warm." "I'm always warm now," her mother said, with a glance at the stove. "This kitchen is very warm." She paused. "I like it here, Ellie." Elena didn't answer immediately. She turned back to the stove and did what the stove needed, and her mother sat in the warm chair and said nothing else. And the kitchen held them both in its heat and its quiet. And Elena thought about Friday with the part of her mind that was always running the next calculation. The next 3 days were preparation of a different kind than the drive had required. She talked to Wyatt every evening, working through what she knew and how to present it and what Ashford might do in response. She talked to Jeb, who knew the community mechanics of Cascade County better than anyone, who owed what to whom, which relationships were genuine, and which were the cultivated kind that Ashford specialized in, where the pressure points were. She talked briefly to George Holt, who came out to the ranch on Wednesday on the pretext of a document review and stayed longer. George Holt was a man who had spent 40 years in legal practice and had learned to make himself look milder than he was, which was a useful quality in a lawyer and in an ally. He listened to what Elena had laid out in the notebook pages and turned his spectacles in his fingers and asked 2 precise questions that went to the center of what she was proposing. "The water rights claim," George said. "Do you have documentation supporting the scope of the access those rights provide, specifically the downstream property coverage?" "Wyatt has the original water survey from when his father established the ranch," Elena said. "And the county land office has the creek mapping from 1871. They're public record." "They are," George said. "And has Ashford ever publicly stated his intent regarding water access fees?" "Not publicly, but the easement agreement he got from the Duval brothers 3 years ago has a clause about access pricing that was apparently buried in the document," Elena said. "Tom Garrett heard about it from someone who worked the Duval property when the deal was signed." George looked at her. "Tom Garrett, from the drive. He has no reason to fabricate it. That's not the same as having documentation." "No," Elena said. "It's not. But it's enough to ask the question publicly in a way that puts the answer on Ashford instead of on me." She met George's eyes. "If I stand up in town on Friday and say I believe Victor Ashford's interest in the eastern pasture is connected to controlling water access for the whole South Valley, and I say it in front of him and in front of the men who own the downstream properties, Ashford has to respond, and whatever he says in response tells everyone something." George put his spectacles back on. "If he denies it, and the Duval easement clause comes out later, then everyone knows he lied to them publicly," Elena said. "And if he doesn't deny it, then everyone knows what he intended," George said. He was quiet for a moment. "It's not a legal strategy," he said. "It's a social one." "The law hasn't stopped him," Elena said. "The loan clause is legal. The moved payment date is legal. Everything he's done has been legal. The law is the tool he's using." She looked at the old lawyer steadily. "But he's also been operating on the assumption that nobody in this valley will look at what he's doing close enough and loud enough to make it visible. That's the only thing he needs to be true for this to keep working." George looked at her for a long moment. "You are not what I expected when Wyatt described the ranch cook," he said. "People generally aren't," Elena said. "What do you need from me on Friday?" He told her. She listened and remembered everything. Thursday was the day she went to see Martin Clavel. Clavel ran the second largest operation in the valley. Not as large as Silver Creek, but substantial, with his own water access concerns and his own loan at Ashford's bank that he'd been careful and quiet about for 2 years. He was a cautious man, broad-shouldered and deliberate, with the look of someone who measured risk the way architects measured load-bearing capacity, always checking whether things would hold. He met her at his gate and did not invite her in, which she had expected. "Miss Carter," he said. He knew who she was. Everyone in the valley knew who she was by now, though she hadn't been aware of becoming known. "Mr. Clavel, thank you for the loan you extended to Mr. Beaumont. I know it wasn't easy to offer." He nodded, carefully. "What do you want?" "I want to tell you something about the eastern pasture at Silver Creek," Elena said. "Not as a request, just as information that I think you deserve to have." She told him about the water rights. She told him what Tom Garrett had told her. She told him specifically what controlling the Upper Creek access would mean for the 3 downstream properties, including his. She told him in the direct, organized way she did everything. No embellishment, no pleading, just the structure of what was true and what it meant. Clavel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The Duval easement," he said. "You knew about it?" "I knew about the easement. I didn't know about the pricing clause." He looked away across his property, toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek course. "If he controls the upper access and he's already got the Duval easement, he has positioning on both ends of the water distribution," Elena said. "What happens in the middle depends on what he wants from each person in it." Clavel's jaw moved. "He extended my note last year," he said. "When I had a hard season, I thought he was being decent." "He may have been," Elena said. "Or he may have been making an investment in your future obligation. I can't tell you which, but I can tell you that you deserve to know what the actual picture looks like before you decide how to respond to it." He looked at her, the deliberate load-bearing assessment look. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she confirmed. "I'll be there," he said. He said it like a man who had made a decision he'd been avoiding and was relieved to have made it, even if the making of it was uncomfortable. She rode back to Silver Creek with one more piece in place and the shape of Friday becoming clearer in her mind. Friday morning came cold and clear, the kind of January day that was honest about itself. No pretense of warmth, just clean cold air and hard light and the stillness of a settled winter landscape. Elena dressed in the best thing she owned, which was not remarkable. A dark wool dress she'd kept pressed in the bottom of the wagon for the weeks it spent in a crate, and she braided her hair with the attention she gave to things that needed to hold up under pressure. She looked at herself in the small mirror in the cook's quarters and registered what she saw without particular judgment. A 28-year-old woman with rough hands and a face that had been outside for 6 weeks, and a plan she was not completely certain was going to work. That was all right. She didn't need certainty. She needed to go. Wyatt was waiting at the barn with 2 horses saddled, and Jeb was standing beside him with his coat buttoned against the cold. And both of them looked at her when she came out of the main house, and neither of them said anything obvious, which she appreciated. "George will be there," Wyatt said. "I know." "Clavel said he's coming," Jeb said. "Told me last night when I rode over. He's bringing his foreman and 2 of his senior hands." That was more than Elena had expected. She filed it and moved on. "Who else?" "Word travels," Jeb said with a particular expression. Not quite satisfaction, but the face of a man who had spent 30 years in this community and knew how information moved through it. "I may have had some conversations this week." Jeb: "I didn't say anything you didn't already know," he said. "I just said it to some specific people." The main street of Cascade County's nearest town was called Millward, and it was not a large town, but it was the kind of town that served a wide territory, which meant that Friday market day brought people in from a significant radius. When Elena, Wyatt, and Jeb rode in at 10 in the morning, the street was already occupied with the ordinary business of market day. Wagons at the general store, horses at the rails, people moving between the merchant stalls that set up on Fridays along the east side of the street. Victor Ashford was there. His carriage was parked in front of the Cascade County Merchant Bank, which had its offices on the main street's north end, and he was speaking to 2 men on the bank's front steps when Elena rode past. He saw her. She made sure he did, looking directly at him without slowing, and his expression did not change, which was itself a kind of answer. He was a man accustomed to controlling what his face communicated. She dismounted in front of the general store and tied her horse, and Wyatt dismounted beside her, and Jeb on her other side, and she stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk and looked at the street and took a breath of the clean, cold air. She did not have a platform. She was not a politician or a preacher and had no official standing in this community. What she had was a voice and a set of facts, and the particular credibility of someone who had nothing obvious to gain and had visibly been willing to sacrifice considerable comfort in the service of those facts. She stepped off the sidewalk into the street. "I need a few minutes," she said, to the general vicinity. Not a shout. A carrying voice, clear and direct. The voice she'd developed calling men to meals across a windy cattle camp for 6 weeks. People near enough to hear stopped. Others stopped because others had stopped, which was the mechanics of public attention. "I have something to say about what's been happening in this valley, and I think most of you should hear it." The street was not quiet. It was never fully quiet on a market day, but it shifted. Conversations paused. People turned. A small gathering became a larger one in the gradual way of public moments building toward themselves. Victor Ashford came off the bank steps. Elena saw him moving in her peripheral vision, unhurried, positioning himself at the edge of the gathering with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he could manage whatever was happening. She started with the facts. Not accusations, not drama. Facts, in the order they made sense, the way you laid out a provisioning list when you needed people to understand what they were working with. She named the loan terms and the adjusted payment date and the administrative fees. She explained clearly and without legal language what those adjustments had done to Wyatt's financial position. People listened. Some of them had heard parts of this. Some had heard the version that Ashford's network had shaped. A borrower in difficulty. A bank doing what banks did. A private matter. Hearing the actual sequence, out loud in public, the shaped version began to look like what it was. Then she said, "But I want to talk about the eastern pasture." She had the map. George Holt had had it drawn from the county land office records, and it was mounted on a board that Tom Alderman, Frank Alderman's brother, who lived in Millward and had agreed to hold it, raised at the edge of the crowd. The map showed Silver Creek Ranch and the creek course and the downstream properties and the access points, and it was accurate because it was drawn from public records. "The eastern pasture at Silver Creek controls the upper water access for this creek system," Elena said. "The properties downstream, Clavel Ranch, Harmon Farmstead, the 2 Duval parcels, all draw from the same source. If one entity controls the upper access, they can determine the terms on which the water flows." She paused. "That's not speculation. That's the geography of the creek, and it's all there in county records that anyone can read." She looked at the crowd, and she could see it happening. The moment of connection. The moment when the picture became visible to people who had been looking at individual pieces. Martin Clavel, standing to her left with his foreman behind him, had his jaw set in the expression of a man who had just confirmed something he'd already suspected. The Duval brothers. She hadn't known they'd come, but they were here, both of them, standing together with complicated faces, were looking at each other with the particular expression of people whose private knowledge had just become public context. "I've heard," Elena said, "that the easement agreement between the Cascade County Merchant Bank and the Duval property includes provisions about future water access pricing." The crowd shifted. She looked directly at Victor Ashford for the first time since she'd started talking. He was still at the edge of the gathering. The prepared smile was present, but it was working harder than usual. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "that's not correct, is it?" The crowd turned to look at him. What Victor Ashford did next was not what Elena had anticipated, which was the thing about planning for people's responses. You planned for the most likely thing, and then the person surprised you. He stepped forward into the space of the gathering with the ease of a man who moved through rooms and expected rooms to accommodate him. He smiled at the crowd, not at Elena. He opened his hands in a gesture of reasonable transparency. "Miss Carter," he said in a tone of patient correction, "has been doing the work of a loyal employee, which I respect, but she's working from incomplete information." He looked around the crowd. "The financial situation at Silver Creek Ranch is between Mr. Beaumont and his lender, as these situations properly are. What I find troubling—" He turned the smile toward Elena, and there was something behind it now, something that had been hidden before and was less hidden under pressure. is that a cook has been given access to confidential financial information and encouraged to make it into a public matter. Not confidential, George Holt said from the edge of the crowd. His voice was mild and carried well. The loan terms are in documents that Mr. Beaumont is fully entitled to discuss. The water rights information is in county public records. The creek geography is a fact visible to anyone who walks the land. He paused. Is there something in what Miss Carter said that is factually incorrect? Ashford looked at George. The smile held. George, good to see you. He looked back at the crowd. No one is disputing the creek geography. The question is whether a private financial arrangement, the easement, Robert Duvall said. He was the elder of the Duvall brothers, a quiet man who had always seemed to Elena to be someone who waited to be certain before speaking. He was certain now. The easement we signed with your bank 3 years ago. Does it include a clause about future water access pricing or not? The crowd went very still. Ashford looked at Robert Duvall with the expression of a man whose carefully maintained surface was developing a specific kind of fracture, not collapsing, but visibly stressed. That agreement is between the bank and the Duvall property. I'm not going to discuss it in the street. You don't need to, Robert said. I've got the document. He produced it, folded, worn at the creases, clearly the original, not a copy. I've read it 17 times since Wednesday, when someone told me to look at the third addendum more carefully. He looked at Elena when he said someone, and Elena gave no indication of what she knew or didn't know about how that information had reached him, because she had been careful about that. Robert Duvall opened the document and read the relevant clause. He read it in the flat, deliberate voice of a man who had rehearsed and wanted to be understood. It was dense language, but the meaning was not obscure once it was read aloud. The easement included a provision allowing the Cascade County Merchant Bank to implement water access fees on the Duvall parcels upon acquiring controlling interest in the Upper Creek access point. In other words, upon acquiring the eastern pasture of Silver Creek Ranch. The street was very quiet. Martin Clavell said quietly, to no one in particular, he was going to charge us all. Victor Ashford said nothing. He was still there. He was still composed. But the crowd had turned in the way that crowds turned when they understood that they had been in a story where they were not the audience but the subject, and the understanding was shifting the air of the whole gathering. Mr. Ashford, Elena said, do you intend to invoke the foreclosure provisions on Silver Creek Ranch's loan if the adjusted payment is not made in full by Monday? It was a direct question in a public space, and refusing to answer it was itself an answer. He knew that. Everyone watching knew that. The bank will exercise its rights under the loan terms, Ashford said, carefully, as is proper and legal. And upon foreclosure, will you move to acquire the eastern pasture? That would be a matter for subsequent discussion. In other words, yes, George Holt said from the side, still mild, still carrying. Something broke in the crowd then. Not dramatic, not a single moment, but a collective shifting of weight and position that Elena had seen once before. On the cattle drive, when the herd reached the edge of their tolerance and moved as one body in a new direction. People turned to each other. Conversations that had been private became adjacent to other conversations. The isolation that Ashford had maintained so carefully, each person in the valley believing their situation was individual, private, not connected to anyone else's, was dissolving in the January morning. Clara Morton, who ran the dry goods store and had a line of credit at Ashford's bank, said to the woman standing next to her, loud enough to be heard, "He came to me last year and offered to adjust my credit terms if I didn't do business with certain suppliers. I thought it was a normal bank thing to do." The woman next to her was Ruth Ferris, whose husband sold feed and had been steered away from the Silver Creek account 2 months ago by what he'd understood to be a bank recommendation. Ruth Ferris said, "He told my husband that Silver Creek was a poor credit risk in November." Someone in the back of the crowd said, "That was right when he moved the payment date up." The accumulation of it, the small individual pieces that had never been in the same place at the same time before, was doing what Elena had believed it would do when those pieces came together. Making a picture. Making the picture undeniable. Ashford was still standing there. His control of the situation had not collapsed. He was not a man whose control collapsed easily. But it had changed category. He was no longer managing the conversation. He was surviving it. He turned and walked back toward the bank, which was the correct move. withdrawing before the situation deteriorated further. His composure held through the walk. He did not hurry, but he walked alone. The two men he'd been speaking with on the bank steps when Elena arrived had stayed with the crowd. What happened in the next 3 hours was not Elena's work alone. She had started the fire. The valley had its own dry tinder that she hadn't known the full extent of, and it caught. Conversations she wasn't part of happened between ranchers who had been circling each other for years, under the assumption that their individual complications were their own business. Money moved through those conversations, offered, matched, pledged, in the practical, no-nonsense way of people who had decided to act on a problem and were now acting. Martin Clavel produced the amount he'd committed to. The Duval brothers, after a long and visibly painful conversation between themselves and with Wyatt in the doorway of the feed store, offered an additional sum, not as a loan but as a contribution, which Robert explained by saying simply, "We signed that easement. We didn't read it closely enough. This is what we can do about it." Clara Morton collected a smaller contribution from 3 of the town merchants who had gathered in her store after the crowd dispersed. It was not large. It mattered. George Holt appeared at Wyatt's elbow in the early afternoon with a document he'd drafted over the past 3 days, a formal complaint to the Montana Territorial Banking Commission regarding the Cascade County Merchant Bank's loan practices, which George filed that afternoon in the county courthouse, accompanied by a detailed account of the payment manipulation and the easement clause, signed by George Holt and countersigned by Robert Duval and Martin Clavel, whose names carried weight. That filing wouldn't resolve anything today. It was a longer game. But it meant that what had happened was documented, official, and would require a response from Ashford's bank that would generate further scrutiny, and Ashford's model depended on avoiding scrutiny the way any model built on quiet manipulation depended on the quiet being maintained. Elena stood in front of the general store in the mid-afternoon, watching the street return to its ordinary Friday pace, and felt something she was too tired to fully name. Not triumph. It wasn't clean enough for triumph. There were 2 cattle she'd lost in that river crossing that she still thought about. There was a gap that had been real until this afternoon, and had closed through the uncomfortable generosity of people who hadn't been asked to care about Silver Creek's problems until she'd stood in the street and told them why they should. That was not victory. That was something more uncertain and more human than victory. Wyatt came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, which was his way, and she had come to understand that his silences were not empty. "George thinks the filing might be enough to prompt a banking commission review," he said, after a while. "If they look at his loan practices across the other counties, too." "It'll take time," Elena said. "It'll take time," he agreed, "but it started." She looked at the street, at the bank's closed front door, at the carriage that was still parked there, the lacquered wood and brass fittings, waiting to take a man somewhere else now that here had become uncomfortable. "The money," she said. "Is it enough?" "It's enough," Wyatt said. "With what came in today?" "Yes. The payment will be made Monday and the loan will be current, and Ashford loses the legal mechanism he manufactured." He paused. "You did that." "A lot of people did that," Elena said. "You started it," he said. She didn't argue with him because he was right, and arguing would have been false modesty, and Elena Carter had never had patience for false modesty. What she had was a practical understanding that starting something and finishing it were not the same as doing it alone, and that what had happened today in the Millward Main Street had happened because years of quiet grievance had been waiting for someone to name the picture clearly enough that people could see what they were part of. She'd named it. The valley had done the rest. Her hands ached, her feet ached. She had been awake since before 4 o'clock, and she had been running on necessity for so long that the lifting of the most immediate pressure felt strange, like putting down a weight she'd carried long enough to forget what her arms felt like without it. "I need to go back," she said. "I need to check on my mother, and I need to sleep for about 2 days." "The ranch can manage without you for 2 days," Wyatt said, with something almost dry in it. "The ranch has been managing without me for 6 weeks," Elena said. "I'm aware." She turned toward her horse and then stopped and said without turning back, "Wyatt?" "The filing that George made today. If the Banking Commission investigates and Ashford's practices come out across multiple counties." She turned then because this needed to be said to his face. "It's not going to fix quickly. He's going to look for somewhere else to apply pressure. You need to watch the other loan terms closely. Everything. I know, Wyatt said. And the water rights. Get a formal survey done, filed with the county. Make it public record that you understand exactly what you hold. She held his gaze. Don't let it be something he can say you didn't know about. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. The gray eyes were doing something she still didn't have a complete name for, but she had come to think of it as the look of a man deciding something. Not about a business problem, but about a person, which was a different kind of deciding. Miss Carter, he said. Elena, she said without thinking about it. She'd meant to say it more deliberately at some better moment, but the correction came out now, on a cold Friday afternoon on a main street in January, and it landed where it landed. The corner of Wyatt Beaumont's mouth moved. Elena, he said. Just that, testing the shape of it. Then, go home and sleep. We'll talk tomorrow. She untied her horse and rode back towards Silver Creek in the long winter afternoon, with the valley opening around her and the creek catching the thin January light where it ran through the eastern pasture. And she did not think about what came next, because what came next would arrive when it arrived, and she would deal with it then. She thought instead about her mother's voice that morning in the kitchen, about a barn at 4 in the afternoon where a man had taken her horse without being asked, about $11 a week and what it converted to when you put 42 days of cold and work and river crossings and damaged hands against it, and came out the other side still standing and still certain that the thing you were doing was worth the cost of doing it. The creek ran east of the trail, visible between the cottonwoods, running the way water ran. Indifferent to what men wanted it to do, following only what the land required of it, finding the lowest course with the patience of something that had been moving before the ranches existed and would be moving when they were gone. Elena Carter rode past it and did not look away. She slept for 14 hours, not the shallow surface-level sleep of the trail, not the 2-hour intervals with one ear always open for the fire or the weather or whatever the night was manufacturing, but the real, deep, total unconsciousness of a body that had finally been given permission to stop. She woke in the cook's quarters on a Saturday morning with the January light coming through the east window at an angle that told her it was already past 9, and she lay still for a moment, registering this fact, and then registered the deeper fact beneath it. The thing she'd been braced against for weeks was no longer pressing on her from the outside. The payment would be made on Monday. George Holt had the banking complaint filed. The valley knew what it knew. Those facts did not make everything resolved. She understood that. But they had changed the shape of what remained, and the change was significant enough that her body had apparently decided it could finally surrender to sleep without consequence. She got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window with the cup in her still healing hands, and looked at the eastern pasture where the creek caught the morning light, and let herself simply stand there for a few minutes without doing anything else. That was harder than it sounded. 6 weeks on the trail had rewired something in her. The constant forward motion, the next task always waiting, the perpetual arithmetic of what was needed and what remained. Standing still felt like a skill she was going to have to relearn. Her mother found her there, which was becoming the pattern of their mornings in this kitchen. Margaret Carter was better than she'd been in autumn. Not well. Elena was careful not to reach for that word, because the cough was still present, and the cold still went into her bones in ways it didn't go into younger bones, but better in the specific way of someone who had been given consistent warmth and food and rest, and had responded to those things the way a neglected plant responded to water. Some of the gray had come back out of her face. She moved with less effort. She poured herself coffee and sat in the warm chair and looked at Elena with the reading expression. "How do you feel?" her mother said. "Like I slept for 14 hours, Elena said. "You look it. In the good way." They were quiet together for a while. The kitchen held the particular piece of a place that had been used well. The stoves, the organized shelves, the inventory list on the wall that Elena had updated obsessively since October. It had become, she realized, more than a workspace. It had the quality of somewhere that had accepted her, which was a different thing from somewhere she'd been permitted to stay. "Ellie," her mother said. Are we staying?" The question was simple, and it wasn't simple at all. Elena turned it over. "I don't know yet," she said. "There are things still to be resolved." She paused. "Do you want to stay?" Margaret looked at the kitchen, at the window, at the eastern pasture visible beyond it. "I want whatever keeps you from having to hold everything up by yourself," she said, which was not exactly an answer but was the most honest thing she could have said, and Elena understood it as such. "I know," Elena said. "I know, Mama." The Monday payment happened without ceremony. Wyatt rode into Millward with George Holt and made the full adjusted payment at the Cascade County Merchant Bank's cashier window. Not Ashford's window, not Ashford's office, but the ordinary transaction desk where bank business was conducted, and received the receipt and rode back. Ashford was in the building. He did not appear. Wyatt told Elena about it that evening in the barn office, sitting across the desk from her with the receipt on the table between them. "That's the immediate piece," he said. "The loan is current. He has no legal mechanism to accelerate." "The banking commission filing," Elena said. "George heard back from Helena on Friday. They've opened a preliminary inquiry. Ashford's going to have to produce records going back 3 years." Wyatt looked at the receipt. "It'll take months, maybe longer, and even then it might not result in anything definitive," Elena said. "It might not." She nodded. She had known this was likely. The law moved at the speed of institutions, which was slower than injustice and faster than nothing, and landing somewhere in that range was often the best available outcome. "The water rights survey," she said, "filed with the county land office last Thursday. George had it formally recorded." Wyatt looked at her. "Robert Duvall came to see me yesterday." She raised her eyes. "He wants to renegotiate the easement," Wyatt said. "He understands now what the pricing clause was intended to do. He's embarrassed and he's angry, at himself as much as Ashford, and he wants to undo what can be undone." He paused. "We're going to talk to George together next week about restructuring the agreement, remove the pricing provisions. It doesn't fix the fact that Ashford holds the easement, but it removes the leverage." Elena thought about Robert Duvall standing in the Millward street reading that document clause aloud in a flat, deliberate voice. "He's a decent man who signed something he didn't fully read," she said. "That happens." "It does," Wyatt said. "More than it should, when someone like Ashford is doing the drafting." They were quiet for a moment. The lamp on the desk threw warm light across the maps and ledgers, the working documents of a ranch operation that had come within days of being dismantled and was now intact, battered but intact, which was different from being undamaged and worth more than the difference suggested. "The hands," Elena said, "the ones who left during the hard months." "2 of them have asked to come back," Wyatt said. "Will you take them?" He considered this. "One of them, yes. He left because he had a family to feed and the situation looked uncertain, and that's a reasonable thing. The other—" He stopped. "The other was talking to Ashford's people in October. I don't know what was said or offered, but I'm not willing to not know it and have him here anyway." Elena nodded. That was a fair distinction. Survival and betrayal were not the same thing, and it mattered to keep them separate. "Pete Dolan's still here," she said. "Pete's a good hand. Getting better." "Jeb thinks so too." Wyatt looked at her with a slight shift in his expression. Not quite amusement, but related to it. "You and Jeb," he said. "We came to an understanding," Elena said. "Apparently." He was quiet for a moment. "He told me last week that you were the best thing that had happened to this ranch since the new well in 1887. Elena looked at the lamp. "That's high praise from Jeb." "It is." The silence between them had changed in character over the months, from the careful silence of strangers managing proximity to something more layered, more comfortable, carrying the weight of everything shared without requiring that weight to be spoken. Elena had noticed the change the way you notice things that happen gradually. One day you realized it had already happened. "I want to talk to you about something," Wyatt said. He said it in the tone of someone who had been building toward a thing and had decided the moment had arrived. "All right." He looked at the desk, and the slight hesitation in a man who was rarely hesitant told her this was something he'd been carrying for a while. "You came here as a cook," he said. "You are a good cook, the best this kitchen has had. But you haven't been just a cook since approximately your 3rd week here, and we've both been pretending otherwise because the alternative required a conversation I didn't know how to have." Elena waited. She was good at waiting when the thing being said needed its full length. "I want to offer you a formal role in the operation," Wyatt said. "Not as an employee, as a partner in the business of running Silver Creek." He looked at her directly. "That means a share of the decisions, a share of the accounting, and a share of what the ranch produces." It means your name on the operational documents alongside mine. He paused. And it means staying, permanently. Not on trial, not conditional. The lamp flickered once. Outside, the wind moved against the barn boards in the way it always moved in January, constant and cold and indifferent. Elena said, "That's a significant offer." "I'm aware." "You should know that I'll disagree with you regularly," she said. "I already do. I'll continue to." "I know that," he said. "I'm counting on it." "And my mother stays," Elena said. "That's not negotiable. She's here as long as she needs to be." "She can have the east room off the main house," Wyatt said. "It's warmer than the cook's quarters, and she should have it." Elena looked at him across the lamp and the desk and the months of accumulated evidence about who this man was when things were hard and who he was when they were harder. She had not come to Silver Creek looking for anything beyond a kitchen and a wage and a place for her mother to be warm. She had found those things and then found something larger growing around them, the way plants sometimes grew where you hadn't planted them, finding whatever the soil offered and using it. She was not a woman given to decisions made from feeling alone. Feeling was real, and it mattered, but feeling needed to be accompanied by the honest assessment of what a thing actually was before you committed to it. What this was? A ranch that deserved to survive. A man who had checked on her sick mother while she was 50 miles away in a blizzard. A community that had been waiting for something to hold on to. And a role that was being offered not out of gratitude or sentiment, but out of the practical recognition that what she brought to this operation was real and specific and worth naming formally. "Yes," she said. It came out simply, which was the only way it should come out. Wyatt nodded. He picked up his pen and then set it down again and said, "Thank you, Elena." She looked at him. "We're thanking each other now?" "Just this once," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. She stood up. "I'll want to go through the full accounts this week," she said. "I have ideas about the spring provisioning that I'd like to work through with the real numbers. The books are yours whenever you want them." She left the barn office and walked across the yard in the cold night air with the stars overhead in the way Montana stars appeared in winter, dense and impossibly clear, the kind of sky that made you feel both small and exactly the right size simultaneously. She stood in the yard for a moment and looked at it, the stars and the barn and the bunkhouse with its lit window and the main house on its rise, and let the entirety of where she was settle into her for the first time without the contingency attached to it. This was not a place she was staying until something better appeared. This was a place she was staying. The weeks that followed were not easy, because things worth doing rarely resolved into ease. Victor Ashford did not disappear. He was still in Cascade County, still operating the bank, still a presence at the edge of every room where important decisions were made. The Banking Commission inquiry moved at the pace of official inquiries, which was slow and grinding and produced no dramatic moment of accountability, just the gradual accumulation of documented record that made certain future actions more difficult and certain past actions more visible. What changed was the texture of his influence. In February, Clara Morton renegotiated her line of credit with a bank in Helena, the first Millward merchant to move her business. By March, 2 others had followed. The community's relationship with Ashford's bank did not collapse. It contracted slowly, in the way trust contracted when it had been demonstrated to be conditional. He still had accounts. He still had relationships. But the relationships were not what they'd been before a woman had stood in the street in January and said out loud what everyone had been navigating around. That was the thing Elena turned over most often in the months that followed, when she had enough stillness to think about it. How much of Ashford's power had always been contingent on nobody naming it clearly. He'd built his network in the spaces between people, in the assumption that each person's situation was private, individual, disconnected from everyone else's. The moment that assumption was removed, the network became visible, and visible things could be responded to. She did not think of what she'd done in heroic terms. She had stood in a street and said what was true and waited to see if the truth had anywhere to land. It had, because the ground was already prepared by years of people suspecting things they hadn't been able to articulate. And sometimes the only thing required to change a situation is to say the accurate thing at the right moment to the right people. That was not always available. She knew that. Some situations had no right moment and no available ground, and the accurate thing, said loudly and clearly, still found nowhere to take root. She had been lucky in the timing. She had been fortunate in what Tom Garrett knew and what George Holt was willing to do, and what Robert Duvall decided when he was given the real information. Luck mattered. She had never believed otherwise. The mistake was in thinking luck was the whole story, or in waiting for luck to arrive before beginning. Spring came to Silver Creek Valley the way Montana Springs came, tentatively, with constant reversals. Warm days that made you believe the worst was over, followed by late snows that reminded you the land made no promises. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and Elena walked the eastern pasture for the first time in the new role that was still new enough to feel slightly unreal. With the water survey map in her hand and Wyatt beside her, walking the actual land against the documented record. "Your father ran it this way," she said. Not a question. "He ran it from the back. I run it from the front." Wyatt looked across the pasture to where the creek bent east before straightening toward the downstream properties. "He meant for me to inherit something worth inheriting. I almost lost it." "You didn't lose it," Elena said. "I nearly did, and not because of Ashford alone." He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a man being honest with himself rather than for an audience. "I let it get to where it was. I saw Ashford circling for 2 years, and I dealt with each thing he did as an individual problem instead of seeing the pattern." "It's hard to see the pattern when you're inside it," Elena said. "You saw it," he said, "in 6 weeks. I came from outside," she said. "I didn't have 2 years of individual problems teaching me to look at each thing separately. I arrived when the picture was already mostly formed." She folded the map. "That's not insight, that's perspective. It's easier to see what you haven't been watching accumulate." He looked at her. "You do that deliberately, don't you? Correct people when they give you more credit than you think is accurate." "I correct people when they're wrong," Elena said. "It happens to apply to both excess and deficit." "Is that what I was doing? Giving you too much credit?" "You were giving me sole credit for something that required a lot of people," she said. "Tom Garrett, George Holt, Jeb, Robert Duvall deciding to read the third addendum, Martin Clavel showing up with his foreman behind him, Clara Morton talking to the woman beside her." She looked at the creek. "I said the words. The words mattered because of everything everyone else brought to the room." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "My father used to say the ranch was only as good as the people on it," he said. "I always took that to mean the hands, the crew." "He meant more than that," Elena said. "He meant more than that," Wyatt agreed. The formal partnership documents were signed in George Holt's office in early April, with George and Jeb as witnesses. It was not a dramatic occasion. There was no celebration planned, which was appropriate because Elena did not want celebration. She wanted the work, the real work, which was already underway and didn't need ceremony to be real. What she noticed, signing her name alongside Wyatt's on the operational documents, was the steadiness of her own hand. The hands that had been cracked and bleeding on the trail in December, that had been raw and stiff every morning for 6 weeks, had healed through the winter into something tougher than what they'd been before. Scarred at the knuckles, changed in texture, but strong. They were working hands. They had always been working hands. Now they were also the hands of someone whose name was on a document that said she was part of what Silver Creek was and would be. She looked at the signature for a moment after she'd made it. George Holt said, with the mild precision that was his most consistent quality, "The water rights survey is officially part of the ranch operational record now, filed under both your names." "Good," Elena said. Jeb, who was standing to her left and had been standing to her left through most of the things that mattered in the past months, said nothing. But when she looked at him, he gave her the look she'd learned to read as the Jeb Calhoun version of everything it would take other people more words to say. She nodded back. That was sufficient between them. Margaret Carter made it to June. Her cough had reduced over the winter. The warmth of the east room off the main house, the consistent food, the rest she'd been denied for too long. And there were weeks in April and May when Elena looked at her mother and thought, maybe. That hope was honest, and it was also wrong, which is the particular cruelty of hope that attaches itself to things that have already decided their outcome. In the second week of June, on a warm morning with the window open and the sound of the creek coming in on the air, Margaret Carter died in the east room of the Silver Creek main house, with her daughter's hand in hers and the son on the floor. It was not peaceful in the way people describe death as peaceful when they were trying to make it easier. It was what it was. The end of a person who had been present in Elena's life longer than anything else. The silence where a voice had been. The specific weight of a room that has held someone and no longer does. Elena sat with it for a long time before she moved. Wyatt did not try to fill the silence with words, which was the right thing. He was there, present, proximate, not crowding. In the days that followed, and what he offered was not comfort in any verbal sense, but the continuation of ordinary life alongside her grief, which was actually what grief needed more than it needed to be addressed directly. She worked through those days because working was what she knew how to do with hard things, and she let herself cry when she needed to, and she did not pretend the loss was smaller than it was. Her mother had been the first person she'd been responsible for, and the last person who remembered her from before. Losing that was losing a kind of witness to her own life, and no amount of forward motion made that uncomplicated. She buried Margaret Carter on the Silver Creek property, on the rise east of the main house where the light came first in the morning. It seemed right. Her mother had said she liked it here, and Elena chose to believe she'd meant it in the full sense of the word. Not just the kitchen and the warmth, but the permanence of the place, its weight, its dailiness. The summer was hard in different ways. The ranch work expanded into the season with the particular demands of cattle country in the growing months. More decisions, more variables, more moments where the right call wasn't obvious and needed to be made anyway. Elena threw herself into it with the same thoroughness she'd brought to the kitchen and the drive and the millward street, learning the parts of the operation she hadn't yet learned, asking questions without pride when she didn't know something, and occasionally being wrong in ways that cost something real and taught her things she couldn't have learned otherwise. She miscalculated the summer grazing rotation in July, allocated too much pressure on the southeast pasture too early, and had to redistribution the herd in ways that set the cattle back 3 weeks in their conditioning. It was not a disaster. It was an expensive mistake that she identified, corrected, and did not repeat. And she told Wyatt about it directly before he discovered it himself because she was not a person who managed errors by hoping they went unnoticed. Wyatt listened to her account of it and asked 2 questions about the rotation logic she'd used and said, "Noted. The southeast pasture has a specific recovery requirement in the dry months. You'll know it now." That was all he said about it. No lecture, no reassurance, no minimization, just the fact of it, acknowledged and moved past. The way people who worked together treated each other's mistakes when the mistakes were honest and the correction was genuine. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated anything gentler. Victor Ashford left Cascade County in September, which was not the dramatic conclusion that stories sometimes provided, but was the actual conclusion that real situations produced. Gradual, undramatic, final. The Banking Commission inquiry had generated enough documented irregularity that 2 of his largest depositors had moved their accounts, and the loss of that capital base had constrained the bank's operations in ways that became self-reinforcing. He did not close the bank. He sold it to a Helena banking concern, and the sale was handled quietly and without announcement, which was how Ashford preferred to handle things that reflected poorly on him. He left on a Tuesday in September, and nobody in Cascade County held a public occasion to mark it, because marking it would have given it more shape than it deserved. He had been a careful, patient predator, and he had failed because the thing he'd relied on, the isolation of each person from every other person's situation, had been interrupted. Now he was gone. George Holt told Elena about the sale over coffee in his office, with his customary mildness. "The new owners will run a more conventional operation," he said. "Fewer embedded clauses." "Good," Elena said. "The inquiry won't follow him technically," George said, "but the record exists. If he tries the same pattern elsewhere, it's easier to see." "It's something," Elena said. "It's something," George agreed. He poured more coffee. "You know what I've thought about since January?" "What?" "How many places this has happened where nobody stood in the street?" He said it without drama. Just observation. How many valleys where the person who could have said the thing out loud didn't for whatever reason? Fear, uncertainty, no one to listen, the wrong moment. And the Ashfords of the world just kept going. Elena looked at her cup. "I know," she said. "You were lucky in the circumstances," George said. It was not diminishment. He was a lawyer. He was precise. The timing, the information, the people who were ready to respond. "I know that too," Elena said. "I think about it." "But the circumstances don't make themselves," he said. Someone has to decide to act in them. She thought about that on the ride back to Silver Creek, about what it meant to act in the circumstances you had rather than the circumstances you wished for. She had not arrived in Silver Creek Valley with a plan to save a ranch or expose a predatory banker or change the power dynamics of a Montana valley. She had arrived with a letter she'd written carefully and a mother who needed to be warm and the intention to cook well and work hard and ask for only what she'd earned. What she'd found was that the work expanded to meet what was needed of it. That was the lesson that the trail and the street and the months of getting things wrong and correcting them had assembled in her. You didn't need to arrive with a plan for everything. You needed to arrive willing to see what was actually there and respond to it honestly. That sounds simple. It was not simple. Most people, when they arrived somewhere, saw what they expected to see or what was comfortable to see, and responded to that instead of to what was real. Elena had tried, from the beginning, to see what was real. She had not always managed it. She'd been wrong about Reeves, wrong about the southeast pasture rotation, wrong in smaller ways too numerous to list, but she had tried, and the trying was the thing. She came over the ridge above Silver Creek Valley in the late September afternoon with the aspen on the slopes already going gold, and she stopped the horse where she'd stopped it in January coming back from Butte, on the high point where the whole valley was visible, the ranch below, the creek threading through the eastern pasture, the barn, the bunkhouse, the main house on its rise where the east room window faced the morning. It was the same view. She was not the same person who had looked at it in January, just as she was not the same person who had looked at it from the opposite direction in October, with a wagon full of everything she owned and a carefully written letter and no certainty about what came next. The person she was now was made of everything that had happened in between. The trail and the cold and the damaged hands and the moment in a street when she'd decided to speak and waited to see if there was ground for the words to land on. Made of her mother's voice in a kitchen and Jeb Calhoun standing to her left at the things that mattered, and Tom Garrett putting half his portion back in the pot, and a young man named Cody saying thank you with the uncomplicated directness of someone who meant it entirely. Made of Wyatt Beaumont saying her name, her first name, just that, as if trying the weight of it, in the cold afternoon after everything had shifted. She was not a finished person. Nobody was a finished person. The idea of becoming finished was the kind of thing you believed when you were young and then stopped believing when you understood that the unfinished quality was not a deficit, but the actual condition of being alive and still moving. There were things she didn't know yet, and mistakes she hadn't made yet, and adjustments she hadn't had to make yet, and they would all arrive in their time, and she would respond to them the way she'd responded to everything else, by seeing what was real and working with what was there. The horse shifted under her, wanting to move, and she let it. She rode down into the valley toward the barn where Wyatt would be in the late afternoon the way he was always in the late afternoon, and toward the kitchen that had become her kitchen, and toward the work that was always waiting and always worth returning to. The creek ran through the eastern pasture, clear and cold and unhurried, finding its course the way water always found its course. Not in a straight line, never in a straight line, but in the path that the land and the circumstance and the slow, patient insistence of moving forward made available. That was all you could do in the end, see what was real, work with what was there, keep moving, it had been enough.